Before we get into tonight's story, I want you to know something. This one was sent in by a listener, someone who has been carrying this with them for a long time. Too long. And when I read it for the first time, I had to put it down, walk away, come back to it. Because what happens in this account is not the kind of thing you can just sit with comfortably. It burrows into you. It asks questions that have no clean answers. And if you've been with this channel for any length of time, you already know the name at the center of this story. You already know what the bell is. And if you don't, if you're coming to this for the very first time, then I need you to go back. Find the first account. Find the second. Because what I'm about to tell you is the third chapter of something have been finished a long time ago. Something that was supposed to be over. Something that came back anyway. My name is MrBallen, and this is the story of the bell. Let me set the scene for you. Anil grew up in a world that most people never see. Not the world of offices and commutes and coffee in the morning. No. Anil grew up on the fringes, in the spaces between things. He was a man who for years made his living in the most unspeakable way imaginable. He stole from the dead. He crept into cemeteries in the dead of night, pried open graves, and took what he could sell. Bones, remains, things that medical schools and certain private buyers would pay for without asking too many questions. It was a horrible way to live. And Anil knew it. He knew it every single time he lowered himself into the earth and felt the cold press of soil against his arms. He knew it every single time he drove home before sunrise with his bag that no living person should ever carry. And the bell, that was the thing that found him because of all of it. Now, I'm not going to retell the entire history here. What I will tell you is the bell was not just an object. It was a presence. A small, cracked, one-cornered brass bell that seemed to operate by its own rules entirely. It rang when it wanted to ring. It appeared where it wanted to appear. And the things that followed its sound, the things that came in its wake, were not things that any rational person wants to believe in. But Anil believed in them. Because Anil had seen them. Up close. In the dark. And he had survived only because a group of 7 brothers, men with knowledge of the unseen world, had intervened on his behalf and taken the bell away to India, far from the town in rural Georgia where Anil had made his life. That was supposed to be the end of it. It wasn't. After everything that happened, after the bell was gone and the worst of the terror had finally subsided, Anil made a decision. He was done. Finished. No more graves. No more night-time expeditions into cemeteries. He was going to live quietly, work honestly, and never again let greed drag him back into that world. And for a while, he did exactly that. He stepped away from the life completely. He breathed cleaner air. He slept through the night. He felt, for the first time in years, something close to normal. But here's the thing about Anil. And here's the thing about people like Anil. People who have spent years operating in the shadows of the law, in the shadows of decency, in the shadows of things most people pretend don't exist. The pull doesn't let go easily. Old habits have a gravitational force to them. And Anil, after enough time had passed, after enough days had gone by without incident, began to feel the itch again. He told himself it would be different this time. He told himself he'd found a cleaner angle. Instead of stealing fresh remains, instead of prying open new graves and taking bodies, he would go after old ones. Graves that had been in the ground for years. Graves where what remained was no longer a body at all, but a skeleton. Clean. Disconnected from the violence of recent death. He told himself this was somehow less terrible. He told himself this made it acceptable. It didn't. But Anil convinced himself otherwise, the way people always do when they want something badly enough. And so, sometime around 2023, Anil went back to work. He brought a park for a man he'd worked with before, someone who asked as few questions as Anil did, and together they began again. Skeleton recovery, Anil called it in his mind, as if the clinical language made it something other than what it was. And for a while, for 3 successful collections, 3 clean transactions, 3 deposits into his account, it seemed to be working. The terror was gone. The nights were quiet. Everything was fine. And then the unease set in. It didn't announce itself. It never does. It was just there. A low hum of wrongness that Anil couldn't locate or name. A sense, growing stronger with each passing day, that something was about to happen. That the quiet was not peace but preparation. He'd felt something like it before, in the period leading up to the worst of the bell's activity. That particular quality of stillness that precedes a storm. He recognized it the way you recognize the smell of rain before a single drop has fallen. He tried to shake it. He kept busy. He went through his routines. He told himself he was being paranoid, that the past had left him jumpy, that there was nothing wrong. And then one evening, he received an invitation to a gathering at a neighbor's home. A celebration in the community, a few houses down the road. He went. He ate. He spoke to people he knew. The evening stretched on longer than he'd expected, and by the time the gathering was winding down, the sky outside had gone fully dark. The kind of dark that comes to rural Georgia in late autumn, when there are no streetlights and the trees block out whatever the moon is offering. At the gathering, there was a priest, a local pastor named Father William, an elderly man who served several small congregations in the area and was known throughout the community for his quiet intensity, his deep knowledge of Scripture, and his willingness to sit with people through their darkest moments. Anil knew Father William by sight, had spoken to him perhaps a handful of times over the years. They were not close, but they were familiar. When Anil finally said his goodbyes and stepped out into the night, he took the path that cut through the fields, a thin dirt track between rice paddies that was the most direct route back to his house. The night was thick and warm, the kind of southern evening that wraps around you. Crickets, the distant sound of something moving in the grass, his own footsteps on dry earth, and then from behind him a voice said his name. He turned, and there, standing in the darkness on the path behind him, was Father William. Anil hadn't heard him approach, hadn't seen him leave the gathering. But here he was, emerging from the dark as though he'd been waiting there all along. The old pastor smiled and said he had a favor to ask. He explained that he had a small service coming up, a prayer ceremony, a blessing of sorts, to be held near Anil's neighborhood in a few days' time. He had brought his ceremonial items with him tonight, he said, but the thought of hauling them all the way back home and then bringing them back again was tiresome at his age. Would Anil be willing to take the bag, just a simple burlap bag, and hold it at his house until the day of the ceremony? He would come and collect it then. Anil said yes, of course. It was a simple enough request, and Father William was a harmless old man. The pastor handed over the bag, thanked him warmly, and Anil continued home through the dark fields. He didn't look inside the bag. He didn't even think about it. He arrived home, hung the bag on a hook in the spare room, the room adjacent to his own, where seasonal workers sometimes stayed when they came from other parts of the state, and went to bed. That night, the sounds began. It started as something Anil couldn't quite define, a noise at the very edge of perception, threading itself through his sleep. Not loud, not dramatic, just present. A faint, rhythmic metallic sound, like something small and hollow being struck at long, irregular intervals. He surfaced from sleep slowly, the way you do when a sound is too quiet to fully wake you, but too insistent to leave you alone. He lay in the dark with his eyes open. The sound was still there, faint, familiar. And then his mind caught up with what his ears were telling him, and he sat bolt upright in bed. The sound stopped immediately. He sat there in the silence for a long moment, his heart going hard and fast in his chest. Sweat had broken out across it, a dream. He told himself it was a dream. He almost believed it. He made himself breathe slowly. He told himself to lie back down. He was starting to do exactly that when something else happened. Overhead, the tin roof of his house, which in the deep quiet of the rural night was otherwise completely silent, suddenly produced a rapid, scuttling back and forth noise. Like something small and fast, sprinting from one end of the roof to the other, doubling back, crossing again. The sound of small feet, or something that moved like small feet, racing back and forth on the metal above him. And then, beneath that sound, threading through it like something stitched into the fabric of the room itself. He heard it. The bell, low, unhurried. The same timbre he had spent years trying to forget. One small, cracked, corner chip brass bell ringing in the darkness of his own home. Anil was out of bed before he'd consciously decided to move. He stood in the center of his room, every nerve in his body screaming. The bell had been gone for years. He had been told. He had been assured that it was gone for good, that the 7 brothers had taken it far away, that it would never find its way back to him. He had believed that. He had built his life on the foundation of that belief. He went to the door, opened it, looked out into the hallway, into the rest of the house. Nothing. The hallway was empty. The sounds had stopped the moment he opened the door. He stood there for a long time before going back to bed. He told himself it was stress, old memories, his nervous system playing tricks on him. He almost slept. Morning came. Anil rose early, as he always did, and went to the spare room to check on his pet, a minor bird he kept in a cage, a glossy, chattering creature that he'd had for several years, and that he moved each morning from the indoor room to the veranda, where it could sit in the air and make noise to its heart's content. It was a small ritual, part of his day, something reliable in a life that had not always been reliable. He opened the spare room door, and he stopped. The bird cage was on the floor where he'd left it, both birds inside it. He kept 2, a breeding pair, were dead. They lay at the bottom of the cage in identical stillness, feathers undisturbed, as though they had simply stopped in the middle of a breath. Around the cage, on the floor of the spare room, other things were also dead. Cockroaches, geckos, the small creatures that share every old house in the rural South. The ones you barely notice until suddenly, all at once, they are gone. Every single one of them lay still on the floorboards. Anil stood in the doorway and counted them without meaning to. He didn't know what he was looking for. He didn't find an explanation. Something had moved through that room in the night and stripped at everything living. He stood there for a long time. He said nothing to his mother or his sister, who were already moving through the house behind him, beginning their morning. He didn't know what he would have said. He went to work. He came home. He said nothing. That night, the cow shit. He heard it around the middle of the night. A soft, irregular scratching from the direction of the outbuilding where they kept their livestock. He got up, took his flashlight, and walked across the yard. The night was warm. The beam of his light cut through the darkness shallow arcs as he moved. He opened the cowshed door and swept the light around the interior. Everything looked normal at first. The straw was undisturbed. The water trough was full. But in the far corner of the shed, their water buffalo stood pressed against the wall, its entire enormous body rigid with a terror that had locked it in place. Its eyes were white all the way around, rolled back to the edges, bulging. It wasn't making a sound. It was just standing there, frozen in a way that large animals only freeze when they have seen something has evacuated every other response from their nervous system. Anil latched the shed door and went back inside. He'd barely crossed the threshold of the house when the sound started again, the same soft scratching, now louder. He turned immediately and went back. This time he moved around the edge of the shed to the other side, and the flashlight beam found what it found. The calf, a small one, a few months old, kept in a separate enclosure at the side of the shed. It was on the ground, and its head was not attached to its body. It had been separated from its neck with a force that left no clean edge, not a cut, not a wound inflicted by any blade. It had been wrenched, twisted, pulled away with a strength that no natural creature of any size should have been able to apply to something that substantial. The tongue protruded from the open mouth, clamped between the teeth at the moment of death, and the eyes were wide open, clouded already, staring at nothing. From the severed neck, blood was still finding its way through the straw in thin, dark rivers. Anil's sister, who had followed him out, took one look and ran. His mother stood with one hand over her mouth. Anil stood there and looked at the thing on the ground for a long time before he could make himself move. There was no animal that lived in rural Georgia that could have done that. Not a coyote, not a dog, nothing with teeth or claws or muscle. The force required to separate a calf's head from its neck with that of clean rotational violence was not a force that the natural world kept in its inventory. They buried the calf the next morning in a field at the edge of the property. Nobody spoke about what they'd seen. There was nothing to say. For 2 days after that, the situation held. No new deaths. No new sounds. Just the bell, a faint, almost inaudible ring in that eternal in the night, and that he could never quite determine was real or imagined, dream or waking. It was always there and never quite there simultaneously. He lay in bed each night with his eyes open, listening, trying to decide. He couldn't. Then the buffalo. 3 nights after the calf died, the sounds from the cowshed returned. This time Anil didn't wait. He went straight to his mother and sister, woke them, and all 3 of them crossed the yard together with flashlights. When Anil opened the shed door, the buffalo was no longer pressed into the corner. It had broken its tether, a thick rope loop that Anil had never seen it challenge before, and was moving in tight, frantic circles in the center of the shed, crashing from wall to wall, wild-eyed, its hooves churning with straw. Its breathing was ragged and heavy. It was moving the way prey animals move when something has gotten between them and every exit. They tried to approach it. They tried to speak to it. To calm it, the moment Anil stepped through the door, the buffalo simply charged the opening, shouldered past him, past his mother, past his sister, and was gone into the night. One moment it was in the shed. The next was a sound of hooves fading fast across the dark yard, heading for the far edge of the property. Anil ran after it. His mother and sister called to the nearest neighbors, who came out with flashlights of their own. Within minutes, there were a handful of people crossing the fields at the edge of Anil's property, lights bobbing in the dark. Anil was well ahead of all of them, sprinting after the sound of the buffalo's hooves. The animal had left the main track and cut out across the open fields, heading toward the far end of the neighborhood, toward the old pond. It was a large, still body of water at the very edge of the community, ringed by old trees, and it carried its own weight of local legend. Drownings, people said, a young bride, an infant, things seen moving beneath the surface at hours when no one should have been at the water. Anil, in his sprint across the dark fields, thought about all of this and felt his stomach tighten. He pushed himself harder. He was almost close enough to grab the buffalo's rope. It was still trailing from the broken tether. When the animal reached the bank of the pond, it didn't slow down. It didn't hesitate. It went straight over the edge of the bank, leapt into the air, and hit the surface of the water with a sound like a car door slamming. The water erupted. Enormous dark waves spread from the point of impact. And then, very quickly, they subsided. The surface of the pond returned to stillness. There was no buffalo. There was no sound of anything swimming. There was nothing. Anil reached the bank and stood there, panting, staring at the water. And that was when he tripped. He went down hard on the bank, caught his palms on the earth, and rolled onto his back. The thing he'd tripped over was warm. He could feel that through his clothes. He turned over and put his flashlight on it. It was a man. A vagrant, someone Anil recognized vaguely as a wandering figure who had appeared in the neighborhood some weeks ago. One of those rootless, unmoored people who drift through rural communities and are tolerated but never quite absorbed. The man was sitting up now, grinning. His teeth were very visible in the flashlight beam. He had the wide, unfocused eyes of someone who had been outside time for a long while. And then he spoke. He said in a sing-songy, childish voice, grinning all the while they couldn't catch it, could you? Go now, isn't it? You're going to be gone too. Where are you going to run? The bell has come back. Anil went completely still. Now I want you to think about that for a second. This man, this wandering stranger, this vagrant who had appeared in the neighborhood only weeks ago, was talking about the bell. He was using that word, that specific word, for something he should have had no knowledge of whatsoever. No one in that community knew about the bell except Anil and the people who had directly witnessed what it had done to him. It was not a public story. It was not something that had been discussed or shared. And yet here was this man on the bank of a haunted pond in the middle of the night, grinning up at Anil and talking about the bell as though he'd always known. Anil's voice came out harder than he intended. He demanded to know what the man knew. What did he mean? The bell had come back. Who was he? Why was he saying this? The man's grin didn't change. He repeated himself. Vav, the bell has come back. And then he scrambled to his feet and vanished into the darkness at a run. One moment he was there. The next he was simply gone, swallowed by the dark between the trees. By the time the Negroes arrived at the pond, the vagrant was long gone. They searched the bank with their lights. They found the hoofprints of the buffalo at the point where it had gone over the edge. They found nothing else. No buffalo. No vagrant. No explanation. They searched for the animal until the middle of the following morning. Anil and several other men from the neighborhood waded into the pond, dragged nets, and came up with nothing. Other men went on foot to the neighboring communities, asking whether anyone had seen the animal. No one had. The pond, as far as anyone could determine, had simply taken the buffalo and kept it. Anil came home in the afternoon, hollow and exhausted, and slept. When he woke, the light was the amber light of late afternoon, and from somewhere outside he could hear his sister crying. He ran out. She was in the yard, her right arm extended in front of her, his mother pouring water from a jug over the skin of her forearm from the elbow to the wrist. Where the water ran, it revealed the burn beneath. The skin had lifted and peeled in a wide swath, and in several places the flesh underneath had blistered into raised tight domes. His sister, through tears and the hissing of pain, explained what had happened. She had been crouched by the clay cook stove in the kitchen, preparing the evening meal. The rice was done. She had lifted the heavy pot to drain the starch water, tilting it the way she had done hundreds of times without incident. And then something hit her from behind. A sudden, hard, deliberate push. Not the stumbling impact of a person walking into her, but a directed, intentional shove. The pot tilted beyond the point of recovery. The boiling water came over her arm in a sheet. She had not seen anyone behind her. There was no one in the kitchen. Anil looked at his sister's arm and felt the rage and the fear arrive at the same time, knotted together into something he couldn't separate. He bundled his mother and sister into the car and drove to the hospital. A long drive, more than an hour. By the time the doctor had dressed the burns and given his sister something for the pain, it was late. Too late to drive back, he left them with a relative and drove home alone. The night was clear, a half moon. Anil walked the last stretch of road from where he'd parked. The same fields, the same dirt track between the paddies, the same path he had walked with the priest just days ago. The air was cool and still. His body was tired in a way that went past muscle and bone. He had been walking for perhaps 10 minutes when he noticed something ahead of him on the path. A small shape. He was still far enough away that the moonlight wouldn't resolve it into anything definite. Just a darkness against the pale dirt of the track. He kept walking. The shape didn't move. As he got closer, it became a child, small, standing perfectly still in the center of the path. At that hour, in that place, a child made no sense whatsoever. Anil slowed. He called out, asked if the child was all right, asked where its parents were. The child turned toward him and started to walk in his direction, and as it got closer, Anil could see that it was crying. A boy, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, tear-streaked and distressed, repeating in a thin, miserable voice that they wouldn't feed him. Over and over, "They won't give me food. Tell them. Tell them they have to give me food." Anil tried to ask the obvious questions. "Who are you? Where are you from? Who won't feed you? The boy ignored all of it. He reached out and took Anil's hand and pulled. Come, he kept saying. Come and tell them. Come and make them feed me. And here's where things get really dark. Because Anil followed him. Against every instinct, against every alarm his body was now sounding, Anil let this child lead him by the hand through the dark fields. And the child led him straight to the edge of the pond. Anil had been at this pond less than 12 hours earlier. He had stood at this bank and stared into this water and watched it swallow his buffalo. He had searched these banks and found nothing. And now, at the edge of the same water, in the same moonlight, he saw something that stripped every last coherent thought from his head. His buffalo was there, or what was left of it. It was on the bank, on its side, and its head had been removed in exactly the same manner as the cat's. Wrenched away, not cut, the neck ending in a ragged, dark devastation. The head itself had landed some distance from the body, and from both the neck and the wound on the head, blood still glistened. But that was not the thing that unmanned Anil completely. The thing that unmanned him was the children. They were everywhere. Dozens of small figures crouched over the buffalo's body, their faces pressed to the animal's flesh feeding. Children, or things that had taken the shape of children. Small hands and small heads and small mouths, all of them bent to their work with a terrible, purposeful quiet. No sound from any of them. No speaking. No laughing. Just the silence of absolute absorption. And in that silence, in the moonlight, Anil could see their eyes when certain of them looked up. Reflective, catching the light the way a dog's eyes catch headlights. Not human eyes. Not the eyes of children. The boy who had led him here walked calmly to the group and took his place among them. He crouched down with the others. He began to feed. Anil stood at the edge of this scene for perhaps 2 seconds. Then one of the small figures turned and looked directly at him. A long, unblinking stare from across the bank. And Anil ran. He ran and screamed simultaneously, which is not a dignified way to move through the world, but is sometimes the only option available. His screaming woke several households along the track back toward the village, and by the time he reached the first lit doorway, he had a small group of concerned neighbors emerging to find out what was wrong. He was shaking so hard he could barely stand. Someone gave him water. He sat on the ground and drank it and breathed, and eventually, in broken fragments, he told them what he had seen. They went to the pond, all of them together with flashlights. The bank was empty. The buffalo was not there. The children were not there. There was not a trace of blood on the bank, not a single disturbance in the earth, not a single sign that anything had happened there at all. The neighbors were kind, and the kinder ones suggested, gently, that he had been through an enormous amount in the past few days, and that sometimes grief and exhaustion produce experiences that feel absolutely real. He thanked them. He let them walk him home. He did not sleep. The dream came that same night, somewhere in the small hours. In it, Anil was standing in his own yard. He was looking up at the tin roof of his house. And on the roof, crouched at the peak, silhouetted against a sky the color old blood, was a figure he recognized, small, proportioned wrong. A dwarf-like shape, hunched and ancient, holding something in one hand. It was ringing the bell, slowly, rhythmically, looking straight at him. Anil came awake so hard he nearly fell out of the bed. And for 3 full seconds after he opened his eyes, the sound of the bell continued in the room around him, clear and close and utterly real, before it faded, slowly, the way a note fades from a struck string, receding, diminishing, and then gone. He lay flat on his back and stared at the ceiling until light came through the window. In the morning, he went to the spare room. He had been avoiding it. He wasn't entirely sure why. But something had kept him out of that room since the first night, since the birds had died and the insects had died and the gecko. He had hung Father William's burlap bag on the hook by the door and walked away from it. He stood outside the room now and breathed. He opened the door. He crossed to the bag. He lifted it from the weight of it. Not heavy, but substantial. He set it on the floor. He reached inside, and he pulled out the bell. His bell, the specific, individual, impossible to mistake object that defined the worst years of his life. The cracked brass body, the single chipped corner, the handle worn smooth where too many hands had held it. He knew every detail of this thing the way you know a scar. He turned it over in his hands and felt the rage come up behind his sternum like something boiling. Father William had given this to him. Father William, calm avuncular, white-haired Father William who attended community gathering and led prayer services and was known throughout the neighborhood as a gentle and learned man, had handed this bag to Anil in the dark on a country road and asked him to keep it safe. But what Anil suddenly and absolutely knew, with the certainty of a man who has had the evidence laid before him too many times to argue with, was that the priest had nothing to do with it. The thing on the road that night had looked like Father William. It had spoken like Father William. But when Anil charged down to Father William's house that morning, bag in hand, bell inside, and stood in the man's living room and confronted directly, Father William looked at him with genuine bewilderment. He had never given Anil a bag. He had not seen Anil that night on the road. He did not own a bell of any kind, and he had no ceremony planned for that weekend or any other weekend in Anil's neighborhood. He had never, in his life, encountered an object like the one Anil was holding out toward him. He took a small step back from it, instinctively. Something about it, he said quietly, made him deeply uncomfortable. He suggested Anil put it away. Anil apologized. He apologized several times. He thanked the old priest for his patience. And then he walked back through the town with the bell in the bag and 1,000 questions circling in his head. Something, or something that could wear a face, had gone to get the trouble to get this bell back into his hands. It had borrowed a trusted face. It had manufactured a reasonable story. It had walked up to Anil in the dark on a familiar road and handed him the worst thing in his life, and he had taken it home and hung it in his spare room and gone to sleep. And the bell, once back under his roof, had done what the bell apparently always did. It had begun to work. Anil went to see the Voodoo practitioner, the Kapalik, the same man he had visited years ago in the early days of the bell. He found him at the same location, and the man took one look at what Anil was carrying and told him to leave. Immediately, without discussion, he took several steps backward and waved his hands in a sharp, warding gesture, and his face carried an expression that Anil had not seen on it before. Not the studied calm of a man accustomed to the strange. Something rawer than that. Something closer to simple fear. Anil pushed past the dismissal. He needed answers. He needed to know how the bell had come back. He needed to know who, or what, had carried it back across the distance between India and Georgia and placed it in the hands of something wearing Father William's face. The practitioner told him nothing. He said only that he had no answers and no help to offer, that what was attached to that bell was beyond his resources, and that Anil should take it away from his property that instant. When Anil pressed harder, the man grabbed his arm and leaned in close and said, "Go. Don't come back. Not with that." Not ever. Anil left. He sat with the bell in his car and thought. He knew from before that simply abandoning the bell did nothing. He'd tried that. Thrown it away, buried it, walked away from it. And it always found its way back. It had its own agenda regarding where it wanted to be. And what he knew now, what the events of the past week had proven beyond any doubt, was that the bell being physically present in his home was not merely an omen or a warning. It was an active situation. Things died when the bell was there. Things were injured. Things came to his property at night and fed on his livestock and led him by the hand to watch. He had to end this, completely, permanently, and the practitioner had refused to help him. The only people who had ever successfully dealt with the bell, the 7 brothers who had taken it to India, were gone. One of them had died under circumstances that no one would describe clearly. The other 6 had disappeared entirely from their community, relocated somewhere unknown, their phones disconnected. Anil was alone with the bell and nowhere to turn. And then he found the pastor, not Father William, a different man, a reverend named Pastor Elijah Moore, whose reputation had spread through several counties in that part of Georgia, and who was known specifically for his work in cases where the conventional community of faith had run out of ordinary explanations. People brought Pastor Moore their strangest situations, their hauntings, their possessions, their unexplainable losses, and more often than not, Pastor Moore helped them. Anil drove 2 counties over with his father and his partner from the skeleton operation, both of them aware of the history, both of them willing to come, and sat across from Pastor Moore in the man's study and told him everything. The pastor listened without interrupting. When Anil finished, the pastor was quiet for a moment. Then he reached across the desk and asked to see the bell. He held it in both hands. He closed his eyes. He sat with it for perhaps a full minute. Then he set it down on the desk between them, looked at Anil, and said, "As the entity attached to this object is old, and it is not alone," he explained as carefully as he could what he believed was happening. The bell was not simply a cursed object. It was a dwelling, a focal point through which something extremely powerful had established residence. And that something had brought others with it. Lesser entities, smaller in power but larger in number, drawn by the bell's presence the way smaller scavengers are drawn to a larger predator's territory. The children Anil had seen at the pond, the small, feeding figures with the reflective eyes, were part of this secondary population. The bell was the anchor. As long as the bell existed in Anil's world, they would continue to come. There was a way to end it, Pastor Moore said. It was not simple. It involved things he had never personally done and was not entirely comfortable describing, but it was the only path he could see. He told them what would be required. "Now, I need you to understand." This person had no reason to lie. Pastor Moore was a man of 30 years of ministry, widely respected, with no stake in the outcome of Anil's situation beyond the resolution of it. What he described was not something from a script. or a tradition he'd inherited casually. He had arrived at these conclusions through years of dealing with exactly this category of problem, and he delivered the instructions without drama or embellishment, just clearly and plainly as a doctor describes a difficult procedure. He said there was a dark moon coming, a night when the moon was entirely absent from the sky, what he called a black moon, a night of zero lunar light. That was the window. That was when the ritual had to be performed. The first step was this: they would need to visit a specific grave, the grave of a person who died young and unmarried, a life that had ended before its proper completion. From this person's remains, they would need to take three things: a small clipping of the fingernail, a small cutting of whatever hair remained, and a piece of the burial cloth, the white cotton in which the body had been wrapped before interment. These three items would be combined with objects that Pastor Moore himself would provide, wrapped in the cutting of burial cloth and sealed into a small bundle, and that bundle would be placed inside the mouth of a specific corpse in a specific cemetery. The same cemetery, it turned out, where all of this had begun for Enil years ago. The bell itself would be placed alongside the body, and the grave would be resealed. The ritual had to be completed in one night, without stopping, without turning back, without leaving any step unfinished. If they started and did not finish, if they got as far as opening the second grave and then lost their nerve or were prevented from completing the placement, there would be no second opportunity. The bell would understand what had been attempted, and the things attached to the bell would respond accordingly. Pastor Moore looked at Anil's father and at Anil's partner and said, "The first grave, you can all three approach together. The second grave, the one where you complete the ritual, only Anil can do that part. Only Anil. The others must wait at a distance." He also said, with a quietness that made the words land harder at every stage of this, "You will encounter things that are designed to make you stop. Fear is the first weapon. You will be afraid. You will be more afraid than you have ever been in your life. But if you stop, if any one of you turns back, then everything that has happened so far is only the beginning of what happens next." He gave each of them a small object to carry, a medallion of Saint Benedict for Anil's father, a crucifix on a cord for the partner, for Anil a hand-written prayer card sealed in plastic with a specific scripture, Psalm 91, printed on one side and a blessing in Pastor Moore's handwriting on the other. They thanked him. They left. They drove home without speaking much. They ate. They waited for the dark moon. The night arrived the way those nights always arrive, all at once, the dark absolute, the sky offering nothing. They loaded into the car with their tools and drove out into the Georgia night to the first cemetery, rural, far from town, surrounded by pine trees. The address Pastor Moore had given them corresponded to a grave in the back section, against the tree line, marked with a small wooden cross that had weathered down to a pale, almost colorless gray. They found it. They dug. The smell came first, as it always does in this kind of work. That specific, organic corruption that hits the back of the throat and doesn't leave quickly. And Anil's partner and his father held the flashlights while Anil climbed down. The remains were partial. The burial had been years ago, and what the earth hadn't taken had compressed and darkened. The fabric of the burial cloth still present but brittle, fragmenting under careful hands. Anil worked quickly. He held his breath and cut the nail from one finger, a single small crescent. He cut a lock of hair, which came away in his hands with a terrible ease, the scalp long since surrendered what held it. He cut a piece of the burial cloth, a strip perhaps the length of his palm, and then his partner reached down and caught his arm and pulled, and Anil came up out of the earth and lay face down on the grass above the grave for a long moment, breathing in the open air in great gulps. No strange events. No sounds from the trees. Nothing to indicate that what they were doing had been noticed by anything other than the three of them. They resealed the grave. They took the materials and drove to the river. The second cemetery was across the water. They had a boat, a small flat, bottomed vessel they'd used before. Moored at a landing Anil knew from his years in this business. They wrapped the nail and hair and burial cloth in the larger piece of cloth and tucked into it the items Pastor Moore had given them. The scripture card, a sealed envelope with something inside that the pastor had told them not to open, and they tied it all into a bundle with a length of cord. Then they got in the boat. Anil sat in the bow. His partner handled the motor. His father sat amidships with a flashlight, occasionally throwing the beam ahead to read the river's surface. The water was black. The sky was black. The boat moved through it like something being drawn through ink, the engine a small, self-contained sound in an enormous silence. Nobody spoke on the crossing. There was nothing to say. They tied up at the landing on the other side and went on foot through the trees to the cemetery. This was the place, the original ground zero, the place where Anil had first found the bell, years ago, crouching in an open grave with a flashlight while the world slept. The place where everything had started. He knew this cemetery the way you know a place that has fundamentally altered your life. He knew which path led to which section. He knew the sound the gate made. They found the grave Pastor Moore had described. It was newer than the first, recent enough that fresh, cut branches of palm had been laid across it, and they hadn't fully dried yet. The earth above it was still raised and dark with moisture. Anil's father and his partner stopped at the edge of the section. They passed him the bundle. They gave him a small penlight. And then they walked back toward the landing and sat in the boat to wait. Anil was alone. He started to dig. The earth was soft. Recently turned earth always is, and the blade of the tool he'd brought moved through it without much resistance. But with every stroke downward, Anil felt a pressure building in his chest that had nothing to do with the physical exertion. It was the specific, personalized pressure of a place that did not want you in it. He had felt versions of this before. He had learned to recognize the difference between ordinary fear, the fear of being caught, of something going wrong mechanically, and the other kind. The kind that was applied from outside, the kind that arrived with intent. From the trees around the cemetery, something was moving. He heard it without being able to locate it. A rustling that followed no wind, that came from too many directions at once to be a single animal, and threaded through the rustling, so faint he couldn't be certain he was hearing it at all, was a voice. Not a word, just a sound. The same note held and released, the way a child makes when it is trying to get an adult's attention without being obvious about it. Anil kept digging. The blade hit the surface of the first bamboo slat, the frame of the burial structure, and he set the tool aside and began clearing with his hands. The slats came up one by one, and in the penlight's small, cold beam, the burial cloth beneath them caught the light and turned it back white. He went into the grave. He crouched at the feet end first, getting his bearings. The grave was narrow and the walls were close, and the smell was different here than at the first grave. Less decomposed, younger, sharper. He moved carefully toward the head end. He set the penlight to one side, propped against the wall of the earth. In its light, he pulled the cloth away from the face of the body. The face looked as though the person had been buried the week before. The color was gone, all of it, but the features were intact. Preserved, somehow, in a way that had nothing to do with embalming or any practice Ale recognized. The eyes were closed, that at least. But from the inner corners of both eyes, moisture tracked in thin lines down the temples. Water. Tears. Not accumulated condensation, active tears. A fresh trail still wet. Anil looked at this for a moment. He held the bundle in one hand. He thought about what he was here to do. He needed the jaw to be open. He tried to move it manually. It wouldn't shift. Rigor had passed, but whatever held the jaw in place now was stronger than that. A clenched, resistant stillness, as though the face were deliberately refusing. He worked at it with his fingers. Nothing. He pressed harder. Nothing. The sounds from the trees had gotten louder without him noticing. He became aware of them all at once, a wall of rustling and that low, formless vocalization, pressing in from every direction. He picked up the handle of the digging tool that he'd left of the grave above him. He brought it down against the jaw with controlled force. Once. Twice. On the third strike, the jaw broke and dropped open, and the face was suddenly, horribly accessible. Anil pushed the bundle into the open mouth. He felt it go in. He pressed it down. He was reaching for the bell, which he'd set at the rim of the grave before climbing down. When the face changed, the eyes opened. Not gradually. Not the slow, swimming return of a person coming out of deep sleep. All at once, fully open, fixed directly on Anil's face. He was 6 inches away from them. He looked directly into them. And what he saw in them, or what he believed he saw, in the fraction second before his body made the decision for him, was not the random, unfocused gaze of something reflexive. It was a look of recognition, of arrival, of something that had been waiting and now knew its waiting was over. Anil went straight up out of that grave as though he'd been launched. He landed on his feet at the rim, slipped, went down hard on his knees, scrambled upright, and ran. He ran without direction. Away from the grave, away from the voice and the rustling in the trees, into the dark between the older sections of the cemetery. He was running on pure reflex, the penlight still in his hand by some miracle, its beam sweeping wildly across stones and grass and the pale shapes of memorial markers. And then he saw lights ahead, 2 of them coming toward him. He ran toward the lights. They were his father and his partner. They had heard him, the sound of him coming up out of the grave, the noise of his flight. And they had come back from the boat. His father caught him by both arms and held him still, and Anil stood there in the dark cemetery with his knees shaking and his voice not quite working. And gradually, over the next several minutes, he became capable of being in the world again. He told them what had happened. His father and partner exchanged a look. Then his partner said quietly, "We need to go back." Anil looked at him. His partner reminded him of what Pastor Moore had said. Leave nothing unfinished, leave no step incomplete. The bundle was in the grave, the bell was not. The bell was still sitting at the rim of the open grave. If they left it there, none of the rest of it meant anything. They went back, all three of them this time together. They found the grave the way they'd left it. Open, the dirt piled at the sides, the burial cloth disturbed where Anil had moved it. The face was covered again. The bundle was visible in the jaw, and the bell sat exactly where Anil had placed it, at the edge of the grave, on the rim of dark earth. But something else was there too. A shape was standing at the far side of the grave, between the grave and the nearest line of trees. It was too dark to see clearly, and none of them shone their lights directly at it by some collective, unspoken agreement. But it was there, still, watching, proportioned wrong in the same way the figure in Anil's dream had been proportioned wrong. Small and hunched and ancient feeling, radiating a quality that none of them would later describe in terms more specific than wrong. They did not look at it directly. They did not address it. Anil's father and partner each moved to one side of the grave. Anil reached down and dropped the bell. They heard it land, a dull, soft sound on the cloth below. Then they took the displaced earth and put it back. They filled the grave. They packed the surface. They placed the palm branches back the way they'd found them. The shape by the trees was not there anymore. None of them had seen it leave. It was simply gone when they looked up. They walked to the boat. They crossed the river. They drove home as the first gray of dawn was beginning to appear above the pines. They went back to Pastor Moore the next day. The pastor listened to everything. He asked several questions. He nodded. And then he said, for now, you should be free of it. He said it carefully. Precisely, for now. Anil is still sick. Something about the nights in the cemetery, about the weeks of the bell's return, took something from him that hasn't come back yet. He is thin. He wakes at odd hours and sits in the dark. He dreams, still, of the small, hunched figure on the roof, of the open-eyed face in the grave, of the children at the water's edge with their impossible eyes. He has not gone back to the cemeteries. He has not lifted a shovel in anger at the earth for any reason. His family is talking about leaving, selling the property, driving west or north, starting again somewhere that doesn't carry the weight of all of this history. He doesn't know if distance will help. He has no way of knowing whether the bell, sealed now in that grave in the old cemetery across the river, will stay sealed. Whether the things that came with it will accept the arrangement. Whether they'll find another way. Whether something will come to evening wearing a familiar face, holding out a bag, asking a simple favor. What I know is this. The bell came back once. From India, across an ocean, into the hands of a man who had spent years trying to forget it, and the mechanism by which it came back. The face it borrowed, the story it manufactured, the careful calculation of exactly whose voice would make Anil say without asking questions. That's not random. That's not chaos. That is something that understands human psychology, human trust, human weakness. Something that has been watching long enough to know exactly which door to knock on. And I don't know what you do with that. I don't know what any of us do with that. But I do know this: some debts, once opened, are very hard to close. And some bells, once rung, are very hard to silence. Sleep well. There's a particular kind of fear that doesn't announce itself loudly. It doesn't crash through the door or scream in your face. It arrives quietly. It settles in. It makes itself at home in the back of your mind before you've even noticed it's there. And by the time you realize what's happened, by the time you understand that something has moved into the space behind your eyes and is looking out through them at the world, it's already too late to ask it to leave politely. Tonight's story is about exactly that kind of fear. And I need to warn you, this one gets deeply uncomfortable. Not because of what happens at the beginning, but because of what happens at the end. Because of what it means when you wake up in someone else's body and hear yourself saying things you don't remember deciding to say. This account was collected from a listener, and it concerns a young man I'm going to call Andrew. Andrew lived and worked in a small community in rural West Virginia, a close, knit place, the kind where everybody knows which fields belong to which family and which stretches of road you don't walk after dark. Andrew was a tailor by trade. Not a glamorous profession, but an honest one. He shared a workshop with 3 friends. Let's call them Marcus, Nathan, and Henry. And together the 4 of them kept long hours, working late into the night to meet ordered deadlines. The kind of work that makes the hours blur together, where you look up from the fabric and the thread and realize that the sky outside has gone from pale evening to absolute black without you noticing. That's important context. Because what happened to Andrew and his friends happened at the intersection of late hours and a road that certain people in that community had been quietly, collectively, consistently avoiding for as long as anyone could remember. The trouble began on an ordinary night. The 4 of them had pushed through a difficult run of orders and finally finished past midnight. A not uncommon occurrence, but a draining one. Henry, whose house was the farthest from the workshop, mentioned that the thought of walking home alone at that hour was not appealing. Marcus and Nathan and Andrew agreed to walk him back. It was the kind of thing friends do. Simple. Unremarkable. Except for the route, Henry's house sat at the far end of the community, and to reach it you had to pass through a particular stretch of road that locals referred to simply as the Bamboo Stretch. It was not an official name. It appeared on no map. But anyone who had grown up in that community knew exactly what it meant. A section of road bordered on both sides by dense, tall stands of bamboo, so thick that the stalks blocked all light from the surrounding fields and left the road in an almost tunnel-like darkness. Beyond the bamboo, on one side, was a patch of wasteland that had been used for generations as a communal burial ground. On the other side, a creek. The Bamboo Stretch had a reputation. The kind of reputation that accretes slowly over decades, built from fragments. A young bride who had hanged herself from one of the bamboo stands generations ago, a newborn found abandoned there one winter morning, a man who had gone missing on that road and whose body had never been recovered, a handful of independent reports from separate individuals over the years of having seen things on that road that they couldn't explain and weren't eager to discuss. It was the kind of place that respectable people walked past quickly and didn't linger near after sunset. It wasn't forbidden exactly. It was just understood. Andrew and his friends understood it. They had grown up with the understanding. And as they set out to walk Henry home, they were aware, at least in the background of their awareness, in the place where you keep things you know but don't dwell on, that they would have to pass through it. Going was fine. The four of them walked close together, talked the whole way, and moved through the Bamboo Stretch without incident. Henry's house of the first Henry was deposited safely, and the three remaining friends, Andrew, Marcus, and Nathan, turned around and began the walk back. And here's where things get really dark. They were approximately halfway through the Bamboo Stretch on the return journey when they heard it. It came from within the bamboo on their right, a heavy, percussive sound like a thick stalk being seized and snapped back against its neighbors. A single sharp crack that silenced all three of them mid-sentence. They stopped walking. The road around them was absolutely still. No breeze, no animal noise. The bamboo was motionless. And in that stillness, from somewhere deep within the stand to their right, a voice spoke. It was clear and close and utterly without an identifiable source. The kind of sound that seems to come from the air itself rather than from any single location. The voice said, "Hey, you three. Where do you think you're going at this hour?" All three of them turned simultaneously toward the sound. There was nothing to see. The darkness between the bamboo stalks was complete. The kind of darkness that seems solid, that the eye simply cannot penetrate regardless of how long you stare into it. They could see nothing. Absolutely nothing. It was Nathan who responded. Nathan was, by all accounts, the most naturally courageous of the three. The kind of person who reacts to inexplicable things with aggression rather than retreat, who would rather challenge something than back away from it. He called out loudly into the darkness, his voice carrying a deliberate edge. He said something to the effect of, "Whoever you are, if you've got something to say, come out and say it to my face. Don't hide in the bushes like a coward." Thus the voice responded, and this time it was cooler, more deliberate. It said, "Very brave of you. Go on home, then, and let's see how tonight goes for you." Now, I want you to think about that for a second, because that's not the response of a person hiding in the bamboo trying to scare passing teenagers. That is something different, something structured, something with a specific intention behind it that went beyond simple harassment or mischief. Something that sounded to all three of them like a promise being made rather than an empty threat being issued. But Nathan wasn't finished. He was angry now, and he shouted back. Several things, none of which bear repeating, but all of which amounted to a direct challenge. "Come out. Show yourself. Come to my house if you dare." His friends pulled him away. They got him walking. But they all heard it, all three of them. The silence that followed, the absence of a response that felt somehow more ominous than any follow-up threat could have been. The kind of silence that says, "I don't need to answer. I already know what happens next." They had been walking for perhaps another 2 minutes when Marcus stopped abruptly. He put his hand on Andrew's arm without saying anything, which was the signal among close friends for a look at this without making a sound. Andrew looked in the direction Marcus was facing, toward the open field to their left, visible now that they had moved beyond the bamboo stands into a more open stretch of road. Three figures were walking along the field's edge. They were moving at the same pace as Andrew and his friends. Not faster, not slower, and they were parallel to the road, perhaps 30 yards into the field. They were dressed identically, in long white garments that caught whatever faint light was available and seemed, in the dark, to produce a faint luminosity of their own. 3 men in white, walking in single file, moving in a way that had the outward appearance of walking, but somehow lacked the quality of effort that human walking involves. Their feet, as far as any of the three friends could determine, were not making contact with the ground. Andrew watched them for several seconds. They were gliding, not shuffling, not floating in the dramatic sense of the word, but covering ground without the rhythmic up and down motion that foot-propelled movement always involves. They were simply moving at a constant elevation, in perfect parallel to the road. And though they were 30 away and there was very little light, and Andrew could not have told you with certainty what he was looking at, something about the quality of their movement, the evanescence of it, the absolute absence of any sound of footfalls on dry field grass, made his skin contract. None of the three friends said anything. They kept walking. They kept walking at the same pace, and the three white figures kept pace with them. And for perhaps 100 yards they all moved together through the dark, maintaining the same distance, the same speed, in a silence that had become enormous and absolute and terrifying. Then Nathan who had shouted into the bamboo, Nathan who had challenged whatever was in there to come to his house. Nathan said very quietly, "Don't look back. Just walk." They didn't look back. They didn't run, either, which later struck all of them as strange. You would think, faced with something like this, that the body's response would be to sprint. But all three of them walked. Quickly, yes. Their pace had increased without discussion, but walked, as though running would change the nature of what was happening in a way that none of them wanted to provoke. Behind them, or rather alongside them in the field, the bamboo starts again, a different stand on the left this time. And from within this stand, as they passed, they heard the same sound as before, the sharp crack of bamboo under pressure. And then more sounds, the bamboo moving, many stalks at once, the whole stand rustling and bending as though something large was moving rapidly through it, toward them. Then Nathan shouted, "Does run, doth." They ran. For approximately 5 minutes, which is an extremely long time to run at full speed. Andrew, Marcus, and Nathan sprinted along that road without looking behind them. Andrew said later that he was aware, at the edge of his hearing, of something in pursuit. Not a sound he could identify specifically, not footsteps, not breathing, but a presence, a directional pressure in the air behind him that his body read unambiguously as something is following you. And then they reached a building. A small, closed convenience store at the edge of the main road, locked up for the night, the metal shutters down, but with a small exterior light, a yellow bulb above the door, casting a circle of warm, completely ordinary light onto the sidewalk in front of it. They ran into that circle of light and stopped, all three of them, breathing hard. They turned around. Nothing. The road behind them was empty. The bamboo at the edge of the road was still. The field beyond it was dark and motionless. There was no sign of the three white figures, no sign of anything that might have been following them. The world looked entirely normal, the way it always looks entirely normal in these stories at exactly the moment when you really want it not to be. They stood in the yellow light for 15 or 20 minutes, letting their breathing return to normal, letting the shaking in their legs subside, talking quietly, checking each other's faces, reassuring themselves through the simple act of being seen by someone they trusted. Then they began walking again, the rest of the way home, taking the long route, the route that avoided the bamboo stretch entirely. Past the far end of town, where the road opened up again, they passed the small local cemetery, the one bounded by a low wooden fence, with a large willow oak on the inside spreading its canopy over the older section of graves. And, as they were passing, all three of them walking abreast, not speaking much at this point, Nathan stopped. He stopped so abruptly that Marcus walked into him from behind. Nathan's hand went out to stop them from going any farther. In the cemetery, directly behind the fence, standing at the boundary between two sections of graves, there was a figure. It was enormous. Andrew said later that his first impression was that he was looking at a tree that hadn't been there before. A tall, narrow, dark tree that he didn't remember seeing from this angle on any previous occasion. Then the tree moved. It shifted. It oriented itself toward the road, toward them. It was approximately 12 feet tall, possibly taller. Andrew struggled for years to describe it accurately, and the description that he eventually settled on was this: it was shaped like a person in the way that a crude sketch is shaped like a person. It had the suggestion of a head, the suggestion of limbs, the proportions roughly right but wrong in the details, too tall, too narrow, the way something becomes when it is imitating a form without fully understanding what makes that form work. And it was smiling. Andrew couldn't explain later how he knew this. The figure was too far away and the light was too poor for facial expressions to be legible. But he knew, all three of them knew, independently, without discussion, that the thing inside the cemetery fence was smiling at them. Nathan said quietly, "We're not going that way." He turned them around. They found a different path, a back route through a neighbor's property, longer and unpaved, and they took it. They reached their respective homes without further incident. But by the time each of them had washed and sat down and tried to process what had happened, all three of them had developed fevers. Not mild fevers. Not the borderline kind. Full, shaking, sweating, can't get out of bed fevers that hit all three of them simultaneously, as though they had been administered the same dose of the same illness at the exact same moment. Which, in a sense, perhaps they had. They spent 2 days recovering. During those 2 days, Andrew lay in his childhood bedroom and had a particular quality of experience that he later described not as dreaming but as being told things. A voice or presence that didn't show itself but communicated, and what it communicated was not coherent enough to remember afterward, but left the strong impression of being studied, of being examined, of something getting a very thorough look at the architecture of who he was. When the fever broke, he felt, he said, like a house where someone had been inside and moved all the furniture slightly. Nothing was wrong exactly. Everything was where it should be. But the arrangement was subtly different, and he noticed the difference the way you notice it when you come home and something has been touched. He shook it off. Or tried to. He called Marcus and Nathan, and they agreed to meet up. They needed to talk about what had happened, and in the way of people who have experienced something genuinely terrifying, they also needed to sit in the same room and confirm to each other that they were all still there, still themselves, still intact. Nathan, when Andrew saw him, looked thinner, paler. He said the fever had been bad for him, worse than Andrew's, he thought. His mother had been nursing him throughout the 2 days. He'd barely been coherent, she told Nathan, but in his more lucid moments he had been muttering, repeating something, a word or phrase, that she hadn't been able to make out. Nathan didn't remember any of it. Marcus seemed the most recovered of the three. He was Nathan's idea that evening. They were sitting together in Nathan's living room, the curtains drawn because the late afternoon sun felt somehow intrusive. Who said, "I want to go back to the bamboo road tonight," but nobody actually agreed to this. But nobody actively disagreed either. And in the way of groups where no one wants to be the first to show they're frightened, the idea simply persisted until it had become a plan. That evening, around 10 o'clock, they met at the edge of town. They had with them a new fourth member. Alan, a friend they'd recently made. Someone who didn't know the history of what had happened to now, and whose presence felt, irrationally, like it might dilute whatever quality of attention they'd attracted. New face. Unknown variable. Maybe it would help. It did not help. Nathan suggested a detour on the way, a coconut palm grove on the eastern side of the community, where he'd noticed the week before that the trees had fruited heavily. They could pick a few and drink the water. Simple, pleasant, normal. The kind of thing you do with friends on a warm night. And the grove was in the opposite direction from the bamboo stretch, which meant they'd arrive at the bamboo stretch from the far end. A different approach, as though a different approach might change the experience. Andrew agreed. They all agreed. They found the grove. They found the specific trees Nathan had noticed. The only ones with coconuts within reach were closest to the fence of the small family cemetery that sat at the grove's edge. That particular configuration, so common in that part of the country, where the living and the dead share the same patch of land separated by a few boards of fencing. Andrew, who was the best climber of the four, went up. He was sitting in the fork of the tree with coconuts in his lap when the quality of the air around him changed. He felt it before he heard anything. A drop in temperature that had no meteorological explanation. A stillness that was different from the ordinary stillness of a warm night in the way that a held breath is different from an exhaled one. Then, very close to him, in the tree, or immediately alongside it, or possibly in the space that was neither inside nor outside the tree, he heard something. A whispering. Not words. Not a language he could identify. Just the sound of a voice producing syllables that arrived in his ear with the warmth and proximity of someone speaking directly into it. He looked down. His friends were on the ground, perhaps 15 feet below him, and all of them were looking not at him, but at the field beside the cemetery fence. He followed their gaze. The cattle were behaving strangely. A group of young calves, really, barely past their first year, that should have been settled for the night were moving in an agitated cluster, 20 yards from where Andrew's friends stood. Moving together, moving toward the road. And their eyes, this was what Andrew noticed from his elevated position, what gave him a specific and immediate chill. Their eyes were not right. He could see, in the faint light from the distant road, that their eyes were reflecting light in a way that cattle eyes don't typically reflect it. A fixed, pointed gleam like a flashlight beam bouncing off glass. He dropped the coconuts. He came down from the tree. He said nothing about what he'd heard, about the whisper. His friends were already moving, backing away from the calves, which had stopped their forward drift and were now simply standing, looking at the four of them with that wrong gleam in their eyes and a silence that animals almost never achieve in groups. Andrew threw a small stone in their direction. It landed short. The calves didn't react. Not a flinch, not a shift. They stood and stared with those reflected eyes and were absolutely still. In the same moment, from deep within the bamboo groove on the far side of the cemetery, there came a sound like a single enormous stalk being broken at the base. A gunshot loud crack that sent all four of them several steps backward in unison. Nathan said the go. Go now. They moved away from the grove and toward the road, walking fast, not running yet, and the cattle, the calves with their wrong eyes, began to follow. Not rushing, not charging, just following, keeping pace. Following in the way that something follows when it isn't particularly concerned about whether you outrun it or not, because it knows something you don't about where this is heading. 5 or 6 dogs in a property along the far side of the road, simultaneously in the kind of barking that dogs produce when something has genuinely alarmed them. Not the territorial alert, barking of a dog that has noticed a stranger, but the frantic, high-pitched, sustained barking of an animal that is very frightened and cannot locate the source of what frightens it. Nathan said they run, and this time they ran. They ran until they reached a section of town where the houses sat close together, and the streetlights were on and other people were still visible behind lit windows. They ran until the road behind them felt populated enough that whatever was back there would presumably find it inconvenient to follow. And then they stopped, bent over their knees, and breathed. When Andrew turned to check on the others, something about Alan's expression stopped him. Alan was standing a few feet back from the group. His face was blank. Not frightened blank, not shocked blank, but empty blank. The kind of blankness that happens when the person behind the face has, for some reason, briefly stepped away from it. Then Alan blinked, and his face arranged itself back into something recognizable. He looked around at the three of them and said, "What happened? Why are we here?" "I don't remember the last few minutes." Nobody had a good answer for him. They parted and went home. That night, the second night, Andrew could not sleep. He lay in the dark and felt the thing he'd felt during the fever, the sense of being in a house where the furniture has been rearranged. But stronger now, more insistent, as though whatever had examined him during the fever had come back to check on its work. He heard things in the night, sounds from the direction of his window. He did not get up to look. The following morning, Andrew's mother came to his room before he'd gotten up. She sat on the edge of his bed with an expression that told him something was wrong before she'd said a word. She asked him how he was feeling, whether he'd slept, whether he was eating. He said he was fine. And then she told him what had happened the previous night. She described how she'd been in the kitchen past midnight and had heard a sound from his room. She'd come to check. The door had been slightly open, and Andrew, lying apparently asleep in his bed, had been whispering. She'd leaned in to listen. He'd been saying, in a voice that was not quite his own voice, I want to eat. They won't feed me, I want to eat. They won't feed me, over and over in his sleep. Or in whatever state he had been in that had looked, from the outside, like sleep. His mother had sat beside him and read aloud from her Bible, Psalm 23, because it was the one she knew by heart, and eventually the whispering had stopped. Andrew stared at her. He had absolutely no memory of any of this. He had no memory of waking, no memory of speaking. The night was a blank. He got up. He got dressed. He did not tell his friends what his mother had told him. Not immediately. But he noticed, when he saw them that afternoon, that Nathan had something similar to share. His own mother had reported finding him sitting upright in bed in the middle of the night, eyes open but vacant, speaking in a voice she didn't recognize. The words were different from Andrew's. Nathan's mother had reported that Nathan had been speaking about the road, about the bamboo, repeating something she couldn't fully make out, but the quality of the experience was the same. Awake, or seeming so. Speaking, not present. And Marcus had developed a rash overnight, down his left arm from the elbow to the wrist, in a pattern that the doctor at the local clinic said he'd never seen before. Red and raised and arranged in no particular medical category. It faded over the following days. He kept the sleeve of his shirt down and didn't show it to the others until they specifically asked. Andrew's father came home. He was a practical man, not given to supernatural interpretations, but he had grown up in this community, and he understood what it meant when all three of his son's friends were displaying the same symptoms simultaneously. He listened to Andrew's account of the 2 nights. The bamboo road, the 3 white figures, the enormous shape in the cemetery, the following calves, Alan's temporary vacancy. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You need to talk to Reverend Harris." And Reverend Harris was not a pastor in the conventional sense. He operated outside the formal structure of any denomination, working from a small building at the edge of the community that served simultaneously as his home, his office, and what he called his prayer room. He was 60-something, lean and measured in his speech, with a reputation that had been built over decades of dealing with the precise category of problem that Andrew was now bringing to him. People came to Reverend Harris when they had run out of other options, when the doctor had shrugged and the pastor had prayed and nothing had changed, when the thing that was happening had the specific quality of being entirely outside the range of things that regular institutions were equipped to address. Andrew and his father drove to the Reverend's building on a Thursday morning. They sat across from him at a plain wooden table and told him everything. Everything. From the bamboo road to the fevers to Nathan's mother's account, to the night to Andrew's own blankness around the content of that night. The Reverend listened. He asked a few questions. Precise questions, the kind that suggest the person asking them has a clear internal framework for categorizing what they're hearing. When Andrew finished, the Reverend sat back and folded his hands. He said, "What you encountered on that road are territorial entities. Old ones, they've claimed that stretch of land for a very long time. 3 of them, possibly more. What you're experiencing now is a consequence of having entered their territory, disturbed their activity, and then provoked them directly." He looked at Nathan's empty chair. Andrew's father had relayed the stories of all 3 friends, and added, the one who challenged them out loud. He drew their particular attention. That kind of direct challenge is read by this category of entity as an invitation. He told Andrew that the 3 friends needed to come to him together. He gave them a date and a time. He said that, in the meantime, they should do several things. They should read Psalm 91 aloud in their homes every morning and every evening. They should carry something of religious significance on their persons at all times. A crucifix, a rosary, a written scripture. They should under no circumstances go back to the bamboo stretch. Not for any reason. Not together and not alone. Andrew thanked him and left. On the appointed day, all 3 of them, Andrew, Marcus, and Nathan, arrived at Reverend Harris's building. The Reverend had prepared the prayer room. The lights were low. There was incense burning. There was a bowl of water on the table that he had blessed that morning. He asked them to sit. He asked them each, in turn, to tell him in their own words what they had seen and experienced since the night on the bamboo road. He listened to each account with his eyes partly closed, as though he were hearing not just the words but something beneath the words. When all 3 had finished, he stood up. He said, "2 of them are here with you now, in this room. I can sense their presence. The temperature in the room, which had been warm, dropped noticeably. Andrew felt it across the back of his neck first, then across his hands. The Reverend began to pray. He prayed in a low, steady voice, passages from Scripture interspersed with direct address, speaking as though the entities he was speaking to were persons in the room capable of understanding and responding. His voice never rose. It remained measured and absolutely certain. The certainty in it was the most striking thing. Not theatrical certainty, not performed confidence, but the flat, matter-of-fact certainty of someone who has done this many times and knows the terrain. Midway through the prayer, Nathan began to tremble. It started in his hands and moved upward through his arms into his shoulders. His face went blank. The same blankness Allen had shown on the road, the vacancy behind the eyes. Andrew, sitting next to him, watched this happen and felt afraid in a way that was different from the fear on the road. That had been animal fear, the body responding to threat. This was something quieter. The fear of watching someone you know become, for a moment, inaccessible. The Reverend shifted his attention to Nathan. He continued praying, but now he addressed Nathan directly, asking him, calmly but firmly, to speak, to say what was present. And Nathan spoke, in a voice that was not his voice, lower than his own, rougher, with a cadence and inflection that didn't match his speaking patterns. He said they were 3. He said the young men had come into their place and disturbed them repeatedly, and the one who had spoken, indicating Nathan, who was presumably now partly unavailable from behind his own face, had specifically called them out and extended an invitation. The Reverend pressed, "By what right do you claim this person?" The voice through Nathan laughed. It was not a pleasant laugh. It said something that Andrew could not later fully reconstruct, something about the invitation, about the challenge on the road, about certain rights that accrued of provocation under certain kinds of conditions. The Reverend continued for a long time. There was prayer. There was argument. The room got colder and then, at some point, warm again, a warmth that arrived suddenly, like a door being opened. Marcus beside Andrew was rigid with his eyes closed. Andrew watched everything and tried not to move. At some point Nathan, or the thing using Nathan, became agitated. He stood up. He moved toward the door. The Reverend stepped in front of him, not physically blocking him, but placing himself between Nathan and the exit, arms extended, continuing to pray. Nathan, or the voice, shouted. Once. The sound was wrong in the same way all the sounds associated with this situation were wrong. Too resonant, coming from the wrong depth in the chest, and then it stopped. Nathan sat down, his face cleared. He looked, for a moment, like a man who has just come off a long flight, dazed, unclear on where he is, taking inventory of his surroundings. The Reverend said, "I've separated two of them from you. The third is different, stronger. It won't leave through prayer alone." He sat down. He told them would be required to address the third entity. He said there was a condition that the third entity had named in the room while using Nathan as its mouthpiece. A condition under which it would release its claim on the three of them. The condition was that a goat should be brought to the old cemetery at the edge of the bamboo stretch, left there, tied to one of the grave markers in the family section. The old section, the one closest to the bamboo. The Reverend would accompany them. He would pray over the site, and after that, if the condition was met, if the binding held, they would be free. Andrew and his father listened to this. They were quiet for a moment. Then Andrew's father said that he would purchase the goat and make the arrangements. A week later, night, the moon was up, a gibbous moon, more than half full, laying a clean, cold light across the road. Andrew, his father Marcus, Nathan, and Reverend Harris drove to the bamboo stretch. They parked and walked to the cemetery in silence. The Reverend carried a lamp. He also carried his Bible and a small bottle of water that he'd blessed earlier that day. The goat, a male, young, Andrew's father had bought it from a farmer 2 counties over, walked on a lead beside Andrew's father with the mild, practical indifference that goats apply to most situations. They reached the cemetery. The Reverend found the specific marker he wanted, an old flat stone in the family section, close to the bamboo stand, with a name on it that had long since weathered past legibility. He had Andrew's father tie the goat there. Then he opened his Bible and read aloud from the Psalms. His voice was steady. The road was empty. The bamboo was still. The goat browsed in the grass at the base of the grave marker with complete equanimity. The Reverend finished reading. He poured the blessed water in a circle around the marker. He closed his Bible. He said, very quietly, to the darkness beyond the fence, "As the condition is met, let them go." Nothing happened. Or rather, nothing happened that was visible. Andrew stood in the cemetery and felt, not heard, not saw, but felt, something shift. Something in the air. Something in the quality of the darkness between the bamboo stalks. A density that had been present, that he had been aware of without consciously registering it, that was now not present. As though a pressure had been released, they stood there for another 10 minutes. Reverend Harris prayed silently. Nobody spoke. Then the Reverend said it was time to go. They should not look back at the goat. They should walk directly to the car. They should not stop. They did all of those things. They got in the car. Andrew's father drove them home. Andrew's father went back to the cemetery the next morning. He went alone. He went to look at the grave marker where the goat had been tied. The goat was not there. The lead was not there. There was no evidence, no droppings, no disturbed ground, no tuft hair caught on the marker, that a goat had ever stood in that spot. What there was instead was something Andrew's father couldn't account for. The grass around the grave marker had been pressed flat in a wide circle, pressed down to the soil, as though something heavy had rested there for a long time. And the ground within that circle, when Andrew's father crouched and pressed his palm to it, was warm. Not sun-warmed, it was early morning, the sun barely up, warm from within. A warmth that had nothing to do with the hour or the season. He went home. He didn't describe it to Andrew in detail. He just said, whatever was there is gone. Don't go back to that road. Don't go back to that cemetery. That's the end of it. Andrew went back to work. He slept through the night. The fever did not return. The furniture in the house of his mind was, gradually, put back where it belonged. Nathan recovered. Marcus's rash faded. Alan, who had experienced that temporary vacancy on the road, never fully explained what those missing minutes had felt like from the inside. He said when pressed that it was like standing in a room with the lights off. You're in the room. You know you're in the room. But you can't find the wall and you can't find the door, and in the dark, you're not entirely alone. That's the part that stays with me, what Alan said, because the bell in Andrew's story, the entity on the bamboo road, the 3 white figures in the field, those things were external. Frightening, yes. Dangerous, possibly. But external out there in the dark, where you can at least look at them and understand them as something separate from yourself. But what happened to Andrew in the middle of the night? What his mother heard coming from his room, that was something else. That was an inside job. Something that had found a way past the obvious boundaries, found a way in, and sat there, in the dark behind his eyes, saying in his voice what it wanted, using his mouth to ask for what it needed. And I need you to understand, Andrew had no memory of any of it. He was in the room. He was present in the biological sense. His body was there, his lungs were working, his tongue was moving. But whoever was speaking in those small hours in that half-dark room was not Andrew. Sleep well. Some places earn their reputations honestly, not through rumor or exaggeration, or the telephone game distortion that turns a bad night into a ghost story over the course of several retellings. Some places earn their reputations through a consistent, documented, multi-generational pattern of things happening there that should not happen. Things that don't fit into any ordinary category of explanation. Things that multiple unconnected people report independently, in enough detail and with enough consistency, that dismissing all of it as coincidence starts to require more intellectual effort than simply accepting that something is genuinely wrong with that particular stretch of ground. The road I'm going to tell you about tonight is exactly that kind of place. This account was sent in by a listener, and it concerns 3 men, truck drivers by profession, who spent the better part of their working lives on the roads of the rural American South. Men who had seen plenty of strange things on long overnight hauls through empty country. Men who were, by nature of their work, comfortable with darkness and distance and the particular quality of solitude that comes from sitting in a cab at 2 in the morning with nothing ahead of you but headlights and highway. Men who, in short, were not easily spooked. And yet, what happened to these 3 men on a single journey? What they encountered on a stretch of road that the local trucking community avoided as instinctively and as consistently as water avoids running uphill, shook all 3 of them so thoroughly that at least one of them refused to ever drive that route again. Not for any amount of money, not for any deadline, not for any reason whatsoever. Let me tell you about it. The man at the center of this account is someone I'll call Samuel. Samuel had been driving commercial trucks for the better part of 15 years when this happened, and he had the particular competence that comes from that kind of experience. The easy physical familiarity with large vehicles, the calibrated sense of road conditions and weather and the moods of machinery, the ability to read traffic and terrain in the reflexive, pre-conscious way that separates experienced drivers from everyone else. He was good at his job. He was careful. He was not a man who made avoidable mistakes. The assignment came from Samuel's employer, a regional produce distributor who moved perishable goods across several states. The job was straightforward: load a full truck with fresh green chilies, transport them across a complex route hitting multiple delivery points, and return. Estimated round trip somewhere in the range of 17 to 18 hours. For a load this perishable and a route this long, Samuel decided he didn't want to do it alone. He brought 2 friends, 2 other drivers he'd worked with for years, men whose judgment he trusted behind the wheel. I'll call them Derek and Marcus. The plan was simple. They would rotate the driving, no single person behind the wheel for too long, and between the 3 of them, they'd keep the truck moving efficiently, safely, and on schedule. The morning of the trip, they loaded the truck, checked their route, and were about to pull out of the yard when Samuel's employer came over and said something that, on reflection, none of them took seriously enough. The employer was a practical man, not given to dramatic warnings or superstitious hedging. But he stopped the truck before they left, leaned in through the passenger window, and said, with a gravity that should have told them something, that there was a particular section of road on their route. A stretch passing through dense forest outside of a small town in rural Tennessee. He described the location precisely. And then he said this: they reached that section of road after the sun had gone down, specifically after 7 in the evening. They were not to drive through it. They were to pull over. They were to wait. They were to continue in the daylight. Samuel said yes. Of course. They'd be through there long before evening. He was wrong about that, but not in the way you might expect. Now, before I go any further, I want to tell you what Samuel and Derek and Marcus already knew about this road, because they weren't unfamiliar with its reputation in the regional trucking community, the network of long-haul drivers who share routes and rest stops, and the accumulated folklore of the American road. This particular stretch of Tennessee highway had a name that was spoken carefully: the Forest Road, or sometimes more bluntly, just the Bad Road. Neither name appeared on any map. Both were universally understood. The stories were consistent. The forest on either side of that road was dense and old. The kind of southern forest that hasn't been significantly thinned in generations, where the canopy closes overhead and the light barely reaches the floor even in the middle of a summer afternoon. And in that forest, according to generations of drivers and locals and people who had reason to pass through the area after dark, something lived, or resided, or occupied. The language was always imprecise on this point, because nobody who had encountered it directly was entirely sure what category it belonged to. What the stories agreed on was this: the things in that forest were territorial. They did not welcome intrusion. They particularly did not welcome intrusion at night, in the hours after a sun left the sky and the forest became fully, impenetrably dark. Drivers who had pushed through after nightfall described, variously, lights that appeared alongside the road and moved with the vehicle, sounds that came from inside the cab when all windows were closed, the inexplicable sensation of additional weight in or on the truck, and in several cases, the cases that people described in lower voices and with more reluctance, direct visual encounters with things standing on or beside the road that had no business being there. There was also, according to some accounts, a sense that something in that forest was connected to a very old source of local spiritual authority, a practitioner, a hermit of some kind, a man who had lived alone in the depths of those trees for decades, who was said to have established certain arrangements with whatever entities called that forest home. He was long dead by the time this story takes place, but the arrangements apparently had outlasted him. Samuel and his colleagues knew all of this. They'd heard the stories. They'd filed them under the broad, practical category of regional legend, the kind of thing you nodded over coffee at a truck stop and then don't think too much about, because thinking too much about it makes the long dark miles harder. They should have thought more about it. The outbound journey was uneventful. Derek drove the first leg. Samuel and Marcus rode in the cab beside him, talking, watching the miles roll past, occasionally dozing. They made their first delivery without incident, their second, their third. By mid-afternoon, they had offloaded most of the cargo and were running ahead of schedule. It was around this point in the journey, somewhere between the third and fourth delivery point, that they first saw the old truck. They were on a county road, a straight, flat stretch through open farmland. Derek was still behind the wheel, and coming up ahead of them, moving in the same direction at a speed significantly below the posted limit, was a truck. An old truck, older than old, a model so obsolete that Samuel, who had been around commercial vehicles his entire working life, struggled to identify it with any precision. It looked like something from several decades back, the kind of vehicle you might see in a museum exhibit about the history of commercial transport. It was moving slowly, leaking smoke from somewhere under the hood, not the clean exhaust of normal combustion, but a dense, irregular smoke that suggested something internal was fundamentally wrong with the engine. Derek, behind them and losing time to the slow vehicle, made the obvious decision. He signaled, checked his mirrors, and pulled out to overtake. Standard procedure. And as he came alongside the old truck, he did what experienced drivers do. He hit the horn, a brief, cheerful double blast. The traditional greeting between two trucks sharing the same road. No response. The old truck's horn did not answer. No acknowledgement from the cab. No shift in position, no sign of any awareness that they had passed. Derek accelerated past and returned to the right lane. The old truck fell behind them. 30 seconds later, Marcus looked in the passenger side mirror. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, where did it go?" The road behind them was empty. Straight, flat, visible for perhaps half a mile in the afternoon light. Not a vehicle in sight. The old truck, a massive piece of machinery, not some that could simply vanish behind a rise in the terrain or duck into a side road, was gone, as completely and as inexplicably as if it had been subtracted from reality. Derek checked his mirrors. Marcus leaned to check his. Samuel, wedged in the middle of the cab, twisted around to look through the rear window. Nothing. The road behind them was empty. None of them said very much about it. They filed it the way you file inexplicable things when you have a deadline and a schedule and a payload of perishable produce. They pushed on. They made their remaining deliveries. And by the time they were pointed homeward and the last of the cargo had been signed for and the paperwork was done, the sky was shifting into the particular amber of late afternoon. Samuel took the wheel for the return journey. And here is where the employer's warning began to matter. The route home passed through the forest road, the one piece of road on the entire trip that had a name spoken carefully, the one stretch that the employer had told them, with quiet, unambiguous seriousness, to avoid after 7 in the evening. Samuel, calculating in his head, realized that the deliveries had taken longer than expected. The schedule they'd planned in the morning had shifted, and now, running the numbers, he understood that they were going to hit the forest road at roughly the same time as the light was going. Maybe just after. He knew this. He understood the implication. He even, briefly, considered the alternative, pulling over, waiting for the morning, camping in the cab until dawn. And then, and this is the part he couldn't fully explain afterward, he drove into the forest anyway. He said later that he wasn't sure exactly when the decision was made. It seemed to happen the way certain decisions happen when you're tired and behind schedule and the rational part of your brain has been running in the background for too many hours. The decision was made before he was consciously aware he was making it. One moment he was thinking about the warning. The next moment, the forest on both sides of them and the sky above the tree line had gone from amber to gray to a deep, absorbing dark, and they were in it. The forest closed around them immediately. That was the thing Samuel noticed first, not darkness, exactly, but the quality of what replaced the light. The tree canopy on both sides was dense enough that the headlights seemed to lose force, as though the darkness here was thicker than ordinary darkness, resistant to being pushed back. The road was narrow and straight, running through the forest like a ruled line, and beyond the headlights' reach, in every direction, there was nothing but trees. Old trees. Big trees. The kind that have been standing long enough to develop their own gravity. Samuel drove carefully. Slowly. The three of them were quiet. The cab had developed that particular quality of silence that happens when three people are all thinking the same thing, but none of them wants to be the first to say it. And then the old truck appeared again. It was ahead of them on the road. Same model. Same impossible vintage, same irregular smoke trailing from the engine. Moving at the same slow, creeping pace it had maintained on the county road hours earlier. As though it had been here, on this road, waiting for them. Samuel put his foot on the brake and brought their speed down. He watched the old truck. Marcus watched it. Derek, in the passenger seat, leaned forward and watched it. It was moving too slowly to make any sense. If the driver was having mechanical trouble, why not pull over? If the engine was failing, why keep going? The truck stayed in the center of the narrow road, offering no room to pass, moving at a speed that barely registered on Samuel's speedometer. Samuel pressed the horn. The sound echoed off the trees on both sides. The old truck did not respond. He pressed it again. Longer. The old truck continued at its crawl. Then Derek said, "Eyes, look at the side mirror." Samuel glanced at his driver's side mirror. The image in it showed the road behind them, and on that road, perhaps 40 yards back, the old truck was there. Behind them. The same old truck that was also, simultaneously, in front of them. Samuel looked ahead. The truck was ahead of them. He looked in the mirror. The truck was behind them. He did not understand what he was looking at. He was not sure anyone could have understood what they were looking at. A vehicle that occupied two positions on the same road at the same moment. That was not a thing that happened. That was not in the vocabulary of the physical world. And yet there it was, visible in both directions, simultaneously. Its smoke rising in identical dark columns from two sets of headlights, pointed in opposite directions on the same strip of tarmac. Samuel pulled his foot from the brake and accelerated. He wanted past the truck in front of him. He wanted off this road. He pulled to the left to overtake, the way Derek had done hours earlier. As their truck came level with the cab of the old vehicle, Marcus turned to look into it. He turned back almost immediately. His face was a specific shade that faces don't usually achieve. A kind of comprehensive paleness that happens when the blood makes a sudden, executive decision to leave the surface altogether. He did not immediately say what he had seen. Samuel accelerated past. He looked in his mirror. The road behind them was empty. The truck was gone. Both of them, front and rear, simply gone. The road was clean and straight and dark and entirely unoccupied. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Then Marcus told them what he had seen when he looked into the cab of the old truck. He said the cab was occupied. There was a figure in the driver's seat, wearing a jacket, wearing a helmet. The kind of full coverage helmet that completely encases the head and face. He had looked at the helmet as they passed, and through the visor, through the darkened plastic of the face covering, there was nothing. The helmet was empty. There was no face inside it. No head. The jacket sat on what should have been a torso. The hands were on the wheel, and where the head should have the helmet, there was only dark, vacant air. Samuel's hands tightened on the wheel, he said, quietly, in the way that people speak when they are trying to keep their voices from doing something they don't want their voices to do. Lord, what is that? And then he pressed the accelerator hard. The truck surged forward. The forest road was empty ahead of them. No truck, no lights. No obstacles. Just the narrow strip of pavement and the old trees crowding in on both sides. Samuel drove as fast as the road safely allowed. His headlights cut through the dark, and in that cut light the trees blurred past on either side, and the three of them sat in the cab and said very little and drove. They had covered perhaps a quarter of a mile when the impact came and hit the front of the truck. A sound and a sensation like striking something solid. Not gradual, not a scrape or a brush. A direct, full-speed collision with something large and immovable. The cab rocked. All three of them were thrown forward against the restraints. Marcus's hand slapped against the dashboard. Derek's head nearly connected with the side window. Samuel hit the brakes. The truck stopped. Samuel stared through the windshield. The headlights showed him the road ahead. Straight, narrow, clear. Nothing on it. Nothing at all. No debris. No animal, no object of any kind for the impact they had all three clearly and unmistakably felt. He said, "What did we hit?" Nobody answered, because nobody had an answer. He reached for the door handle. He was going to get out. He was going to look at the front of the truck, check for damage, try to understand what had just happened. Marcus and Derek said simultaneously, "Don't stop. Don't get out. Keep moving." Their voices carried the specific register of people who've made a clear-eyed assessment of a situation and arrived at a conclusion that is being transmitted with as much urgency as their vocal cords can deliver. Samuel's hand came away from the door handle. He looked at them. They were both looking forward, through the windshield, and their expressions, in the green light of the dashboard instruments, were not the expressions of people who wanted to stop and investigate. Derek said. "We didn't hit anything physical. Whatever that was, it's not damage, just drive." Yeah, Samuel drove, but here's the thing nobody could explain. From the moment of the impact, the truck felt different. Heavier, substantially heavier, in a way that had nothing to do with the cargo, which was empty, the truck run unladen on the return journey. The steering pulled. The engine labored. The needle on the speedometer climbed with a reluctance that Samuel had never felt from this vehicle before, as though something was pressing down on the entire truck from above, or hanging from it, or riding in it, something that had mass, enough mass to register in the handling of a Via designed to carry tons of freight. Samuel gripped the wheel. He fought the steering. He kept the truck moving, and from somewhere in the cab, or from somewhere that was simultaneously inside the cab and not inside the cab, in that ambiguous spatial zone that the human ear cannot reliably triangulate, a sound began, faint at first, a brushing sound like clothing against a surface, then a second sound layered beneath it, lower, rhythmic, the sound of breathing that was not any of theirs. Derek said, very quietly, "Something is on the truck." Samuel felt it too. Not heard, felt. A sensation in the wheel, in the floor beneath his feet, in the vibration of the seat beneath him. A presence in the vehicle that had not been there before the impact. Something that had attached itself to them when they struck whatever was on the road. Something that was now with them. He pressed the accelerator. The truck groaned and moved faster, sluggishly, and the trees on either side began to thin. Just slightly, the canopy opening above them in small patches that let through a faint trace of starlight. The end of the deep forest section was ahead. He could not see it, but he could feel it, the way you feel the opening up of space before you can see it. And then, ahead of them, at the edge of the headlights' reach, beside the road, a figure, standing in the grass at the edge of the pavement, not on the road, just off it, standing very still, facing the truck. In the headlights, the figure resolved slowly as they approached, a shape, a size, a set of proportions that were human but wrong in the ways that the old truck had been wrong. Too still, too precisely positioned. A person standing at the side of a forest road in complete darkness at this hour would have some quality of reaction to approaching headlights. Would shield their eyes, would step back, would show some sign of being a living organism responding to stimuli. This figure did not move at all. Samuel drove past it. In the brief moment of passing, all three of them got a clear look. A woman, dressed in white, layered, old-fashioned white fabric, the kind that had no business being clean on a rural forest road at this hour. Hair long and loose, falling past her shoulders, dark against the white of her clothing. Her face turned toward the truck as they passed it, and in the fraction of a second that the headlights caught her full on, they saw her face. It was wrong, not in a way that could be attributed to shadow or distortion. The features were asymmetric in a way that moved beyond the ordinary asymmetry of human faces. One eye larger than the other, significantly larger, bulging slightly, positioned too high on the face. The other eye smaller and lower, drawn down toward the cheek. The skin was not a color that living skin is, and the expression, if it was an expression, communicated nothing them could name. Not malice, not recognition, something that had no human analog. She was moving alongside the truck, not running, not even walking at a conventional pace. Simply keeping up at whatever speed the truck was traveling, gliding through the long grass at the road's edge with the same frictionless, effortless locomotion that the three white figures in the field had shown Andrew and his friends on the bamboo road. Marcus made a sound, not a word, just a sound. He faced forward and kept his eyes on the dashboard. Derek said, "Don't look at her." Samuel, eyes on the road. Samuel looked at the road. He thought, in that moment, and this is the part he found most disturbing when he recounted it afterward, he thought something entirely involuntary. Something that arrived in his mind without his permission. He thought about the woman's face, about the way it was wrong, about the specific wrongness of the asymmetry, the specific shade of the skin, the specific quality of the eyes. And some part of his mind produced, without being asked, an evaluation. He thought of, "That's the ugliest thing I have ever seen," and he did not say this aloud. It arrived and he suppressed it, and he kept his eyes forward and said nothing. But Marcus said, from the passenger seat, in a very controlled voice, "Whatever you're thinking about her, stop. Right now. Don't let the thought finish." Samuel looked at him. Marcus said, "So I had a thought and she looked directly at me. Don't think about her face. Don't evaluate it. Don't let your brain do what it's trying to do right now." Samuel stared at the road and cleared his mind as deliberately as he could. He thought about the engine temperature. He thought about the route ahead. He thought about anything that was concrete and mechanical and entirely free of any relationship to the woman keeping pace with them in the grass. And then she was gone. The road opened up. The forest thinning decisively on both sides, the canopy breaking, the sky above them expanding from a narrow strip to a wide, dark, star-scattered vault. And with the opening of the road, The woman at its edge simply was not there anymore. No diminishing figure in the mirrors. No last glimpse of white in the tree line. One moment she was there. The next, the road was empty on both sides, and the weight on the truck was gone, and the laboring of the engine resolved into its normal register, and the steering straightened in Samuel's hands. He drove for another mile before he said anything. Then he pulled over to the side of the road, a wide gravel shoulder, nothing around them but open farmland, and turned off the engine. The three of them sat in the silence for a long moment. Then Derek said, "We need to check the front of the trunk." They got out. They walked around to the front. In the beam of a flashlight, they examined the grille, the bumper, the hood, every surface that faced forward. There was no damage, not a scratch, not a dent, not a scuff on the paint. Whatever they had hit on that forest road had left no mark on the vehicle at all. Samuel crouched in front of the bumper and looked at the ground beneath the truck. The gravel of the shoulder was clean. He stood up. He looked at his friends. He said, "What was that?" Neither of them had an answer, but Marcus said something that all three of them found in the weeks that followed difficult to stop thinking about. He said, "She heard me. When I had the thought about her face, she heard it. Not the words. I didn't say the words. She heard the thought. Before I said them. She was already turning toward me before I let the thought complete." And then he described what happened when the woman's face turned toward him directly. He said the face, up close, as they had passed, had moved. Not the ambient motion of a face that is animated by breathing or muscle tension. The face had moved deliberately. The larger eye had widened further. The misaligned features had shifted, in the fraction of a second that they were in full view, into something that had the structure of a smile without any of the warmth. She had smiled at him, because she had heard his thought, because she had known what he was thinking about her appearance, before he had fully formed the thought himself. And I need you to understand, that is the detail that kept me awake thinking about this story, not the headless driver, not the truck that occupied two places at once, not the impossible weight on the vehicle, or the breathing in the cab, or the woman gliding through the forest grass at highway speed. Those are the kind of things that are terrifying in the moment and that the mind eventually constructs a wall around because they are external. They happen out there in the world to the body. But the thought that was heard before it was fully formed, that is something else. That is something that existed inside Marcus, in the private, unvoiced interior space of his own mind, where no one else is supposed to have access. And something reached in. Something heard it anyway. Something responded to it from the outside before he had even decided what it was. They drove home. The rest of the journey, the final hours through ordinary roads and ordinary darkness, produced nothing unusual. They arrived back at the yard in the pre-dawn hours, exhausted, and little remained of the cargo. The next day, Marcus called in sick. Samuel drove to check on him. Marcus was in his apartment, curtains drawn, and he looked like a man who had not slept and did not intend to sleep anytime soon. He told Samuel about the dreams. He said they had started the same night, on the drive home, a kind of half-waking vision that arrived whenever his eyes closed. In the vision, he was back on the forest road, standing on the road, not in the truck. And the woman was there, at the edge of the trees, looking at him, not approaching, just looking, and each time he was in the vision, she said the same thing, in a voice that was not the voice of anything he'd heard before, layered and wrong in its frequencies, the way a sound is wrong when it's been recorded and played back at the wrong speed. She said, "Do you believe me now? I was beautiful. I was beautiful and Thelmert otherwise. Tell me you believe me." Marcus said he would wake up, or return to wakefulness, whatever the accurate term was, and he would be sitting upright in bed with the word yes already in his mouth. He had said yes. He didn't know how many times. He had said yes, in whatever that state was, to whatever had been asking. He didn't know what saying yes meant. He didn't know what he had agreed to. He said to Samuel's, "I'm not going back on that road. Ever. I don't care what the job is. I don't care what they pay. I am never going through that forest to the end." Samuel said he understood. He didn't argue. He had his own version of the past 3 days to contend with. The phantom weight on the truck, the impact with nothing, the old truck that appeared in front of and behind them simultaneously, the woman's impossible speed in the grass. He had managed to sleep, but the sleep wasn't right. It sat on him wrong in the mornings. He woke with a residue of something he couldn't name. Derek was the quietest of the three in the aftermath. He didn't describe dreams. He didn't report voices. But he stopped talking about the journey almost immediately, in the way that people sometimes stop talking about a thing because the talking itself seems, to them, like a risk. Like it might remind something that has begun to forget where they live. 3 experienced truckers. Men who had driven in ice storms and fog banks and on mountain switchbacks at midnight. Men who had faced down aggressive drivers and dangerous loads and every variety of mechanical failure in the middle of nowhere. Men who were, by the accumulated evidence of their careers, quite difficult to genuinely frighten. All three of them spent the weeks after the forest road in a state of quiet, persistent unease that none of them had a name for. The kind of unease that doesn't peak and resolve. The kind that simply becomes the new background register of experience. A permanent, low-level awareness that the world is somewhat larger and somewhat stranger than the version of it that gets discussed in polite company. And what they couldn't answer, what none of them could answer, and what I can't answer for them, is this. The employer's warning was specific. After sunset. Don't go through after sunset. And Samuel drove through anyway, in a state he later described as something like a lapse. A moment where the decision seemed to make itself, where his own agency was somehow absent from a choice his body made. What decides when we make decisions we can't account for? What is it that occasionally reaches into the machinery of a perfectly competent, rational adult and nudges the wheel? What was it that, on that particular evening on that particular route, made Samuel turn into the forest instead of pulling over and waiting for morning? Was it fatigue? Was it deadline pressure? Was it the simple, mundane accumulation of a long day making the sensible choice feel like more effort than the habitual one? Or was it something else? Something that had been watching the truck approach from a long way off, that had made certain calculations that had reached. The way something reaches into a private thought before it is finished, and redirected a hand on a steering wheel. I don't know. Samuel doesn't know, he has said. In the time since that, the question bothers him more than any single thing he saw on that road. More than the headless driver. More than the woman in white. More than the impact with nothing. Because the things on the road were frightening, but they were external out there. The thing that made him turn into the forest. If it was a thing, if it wasn't just tiredness and poor judgment, that was inside, before road, before any of it. Already there, already working, already in the cab with them from the moment they set out. Sleep well. There is a particular kind of story that I find more unsettling than any other, not the dramatic kind. Not the story where something enormous and obviously terrible announces itself with sound and fury and leaves no room for doubt. Those stories are frightening, yes, but the fear they produce is clean, direct. You know what you're afraid of. You can point at it. The kind of story I find more unsettling is the quiet kind. The kind where everything looks normal. Where the world around you is proceeding exactly as it should. Where there is nothing you can point to, nothing you can name, nothing that would convince anyone else that anything is wrong. And yet something is there, riding with you. Sitting in your blind spot. Waiting for the moment when you notice it, and then, when you do notice it, smiling. Tonight's final story is that kind of story. And I want to be upfront with you. The man at the center of this account did not encounter anything on the scale of what we've heard in the previous 3 stories tonight. He did not see an army of children feeding at a waterside. He did not have something move into his body while he slept. He did not drive through a forest that reached into his thoughts. What he encountered was smaller than all of that, more contained, more personal, and somehow, for reasons I'm still working out, more disturbing. This account was sent in by a listener and concerns a man I'll call Aaron. Aaron drove trucks for a regional produce distributor. His job was to transport fresh fruit and vegetables from a central depot to supermarkets and grocery stores across a wide area of rural Georgia and Tennessee. It was honest, unglamorous work. Long hours. A lot of time alone. A lot of miles on roads that most people never see, through parts of the country that the interstate bypasses entirely. Aaron was good at it. He was experienced, reliable, and had the easy physical confidence of a man who has spent years operating heavy machinery without incident. This is the story of one particular delivery run that changed the way Aaron thought about solitude, about the space inside a vehicle, about what it means to be, or to believe yourself to be, entirely alone. The job was a standard one. A large supermarket chain had placed a bulk order for fresh produce, fruit and vegetables, the full range, and Aaron's employer needed it delivered on a specific day, to a specific loading dock by a specific time. Aaron was given the assignment on a Tuesday morning, loaded his truck, checked his paperwork, and set out. The drive to the delivery point was approximately an hour and a half. Straightforward route. Roads he knew well. He left the depot in the early afternoon and made good time, arriving at the supermarket's loading dock just after 4:30. He pulled into the bay, killed the engine, and climbed down from the cab. The first odd thing happened almost immediately. As Aaron walked around the front of the truck toward the loading dock entrance, he noticed that the truck was sitting unevenly. Not dramatically, not the obvious lean of a blown tire, but a subtle, persistent list to one side. He crouched and checked all 4 tires. They were fine. He checked the suspension. Nothing obviously wrong. He stood up and looked at the truck from a distance. It was still slightly off. Level, as though the weight distribution of the cargo had shifted during transit and settled unevenly. He put it out of his mind. The cargo was what mattered. He found the dock supervisor, a man he knew by name, someone he dealt with on previous deliveries, and they began the process of unloading. As they worked, going back and forth between the truck and the storage area, the dock supervisor said something casual, conversational. He said it the way you might mention the weather. Just an observation, not expecting much of a response. He said, "Hey Aaron, the two guys you brought with you, they staying in the cab. You want me to send somebody out with water or anything?" Aaron stopped. He turned to look at the man. He said, "What two guys?" The dock supervisor looked back at him with the mild confusion of someone who believes they have stated something obvious. He said he'd seen them when Aaron pulled in. Two men sitting in the back seat of the cab. He'd seen them clearly through the window as the truck came through the gate. He'd assumed they were colleagues, other drivers catching a ride or assistants helping with the delivery. Aaron told him that he had driven alone, that there was no one else in the truck, that he had been by himself since leaving the depot. The dock supervisor looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at the truck. Then he shrugged in the particular way that people shrug when they have decided, for the sake of social smoothness, to let something go. He said he must have been mistaken. Light playing tricks, he moved on. Aaron finished the unloading. He signed the paperwork. And then, before climbing back into the cab, he walked around the truck and looked through every window. The cab was empty. The back seat, a narrow utilitarian bench behind the two front seats, more storage space than seating, was empty. There was nothing there, nobody there. He told himself the dock supervisor had been mistaken. He climbed into the cab. He started the engine. He pulled out of the loading bay and headed back toward the depot. Now here is where I need you to pay attention, because what happened next is not dramatic. It is not the kind of thing that would make a compelling film scene. It is the kind of thing that is deeply, specifically, anatomically unsettling because of how small it is, because of how ordinary the container is that it arrives in. Aaron had been driving for perhaps 20 minutes when he decided he was hungry. He pulled into the car park of a small family-owned diner on the county road, a place he'd stopped at perhaps a dozen times over the years, run by a woman he knew by sight. He parked, locked the truck out of habit, went inside, ordered food, and sat at the counter. While he was eating, the woman who ran the diner came over. She was a chatty person by nature, the kind of person who fills silence easily and without agenda. She made some remark about the weather. She asked how business was, and then, with the same casual register as the dock supervisor, she said something that arrived in Aaron's chest like a stone dropped into still water. She said, "Your friend's still sitting out in the truck. He not hungry?" Aaron put down his fork. He said, "I don't have a friend with me. I'm alone." The woman the window toward the car park. She had the expression of someone looking at something they're confident they saw. She said she had watched Aaron pull in, and she had seen, clearly through the passenger window, a man sitting in the cab. Not in the front passenger seat. In the back. Sitting upright, facing forward. Completely still. Aaron said, "Again, there is no one in my truck." The woman looked at the truck. She looked at Aaron. She said, with less certainty now, "He was there when you pulled in. I watched you park." Aaron left his food half-eaten. He left money on the counter and walked out to the truck. He unlocked it. He opened every door. He checked the back seat with his hands, ran his palms across the vinyl, pressed down on the cushion, checked every corner and crevice. He opened the cargo area and walked its length. He checked underneath the vehicle. Nothing. Nobody. The truck was as it had been when he'd driven it away from the loading dock. He stood in the car park for a moment. Two separate people, at two separate locations, a significant distance apart, had independently reported seeing a person sitting in the back of his truck. Both of them had described the figure in essentially the same terms, in the back seat, facing forward. Still, Aaron was not a man given to what he privately categorized as nonsense. He was practical. He worked in a practical industry. He dealt in weights and volumes and delivery schedules and fuel costs. He had a framework for the world, and that framework did not contain invisible passengers. But two people had seen it. Two entirely unconnected people, neither of whom had any reason to lie, neither of whom knew each other, at different times and different locations on the same road, both describing the same thing in the same seat. He got back in the truck. He sat for a moment before starting the engine. He looked in the rear view mirror. The back seat was empty in the reflection. He looked over his left shoulder, physically turning his head to see the back seat directly. Empty. He started the engine. He pulled out of the car park. He turned the radio on, louder than usual, filling the cab with sound. He drove for 10 minutes, 15. The familiar roads unrolled in front of him. Nothing happened. The radio played. The engine ran steadily. The evening light was thickening toward dusk on the fields outside the windows. And then, without drama, without any kind of preamble or build-up or warning, the silence inside the cab changed. Not the acoustic silence. The radio was still playing. But underneath the radio, in the same way that you can hear a second conversation at a party, if you stop paying attention to the one you're in, Aaron became aware of a quality of presence in the cab that he could not account for and could not locate. It was not a sound. It was the negative space around a sound, the specific shape that silence takes when it is organized around a source. He checked the mirror again. The back seat was empty in the reflection. His hands tightened on the wheel. He drove another mile. The presence, if that was what it was, did not diminish. It held. It was patient. It occupied the back of the cab with the settled quality of something that had been there for a long time and was in no particular hurry. Aaron took his right hand off the wheel and turned the radio off. In the silence, he heard it. A cough. A single dry, perfectly ordinary human cough coming from the back seat of his truck. Not loud, not performed. The kind of cough a person produces when something irritates the throat. Involuntary, brief, quickly suppressed. The kind of cough that a person makes when they are trying not to make noise and fails slightly. Aaron pulled over. He did not stop gradually. He cut the wheel hard and hit the brake and brought the truck to a stop on the grass verge beside the road in a series of movements that were more reflex than decision. His heart was doing something in his chest that he would later describe as trying to get out. He gripped the steering wheel with both hands and stared through the windshield at the empty road ahead. He did not turn around. He did not look in the mirror. For a period of time that he could not accurately estimate afterward. It might have been 30 seconds, it might have been 3 minutes. He simply sat there, gripping the wheel, facing forward, breathing. And then, from the back seat, the voice spoke. It was a man's voice, deep, unhurried, and it said, in perfectly clear English, 4 words. A brother. Give me some. Now, I want you to think about that for a second, because those 4 words, a brother, give me some, are not the words of a ghost story. They are not the words of a horror film. They are completely ordinary words. Words you might hear from a friend, or a stranger on a bus, or a man in a queue asking to borrow a pen. There is nothing in those 4 words that should, in isolation, frighten anyone. But Aaron was alone in a locked truck on a county road in rural Georgia, and the voice said them from the back seat, and Aaron's entire nervous system received them as the most terrifying thing it had ever processed. He knew, immediately, completely, without any need for analysis, that what was in the back seat of his truck was not a person. A person he could have been angry at. A person he could have dealt with. You stow away in someone's truck. You get caught, you have a conversation about it. That is a thing that happens in the world and has a manageable shape. But the 2 people who had seen the figure in his truck had described it as completely still, facing forward, not speaking, not moving, not eating or drinking or doing any of the things a living person does in an enclosed space over the course of a journey. And what a living person does not do, what no living person does, is produce a cough that is trying to be quiet, a cough that is suppressed, a cough that has the self-consciousness of something that did not intend to make noise. A living stowaway who didn't want to be found would not cough. A living stowaway would be flattened into the smallest possible shape, holding every breath, waiting. The cough was involuntary. The cough was a slip. And whatever had been sitting in the back of Aaron's truck for the entire duration of his journey had, for one moment, slipped. Aaron's mind, in the seconds following the voice, produced the following information in rapid sequential order. First, there was an old piece of understanding in the community where he'd grown up, passed down through the older generation the way genuinely practical information gets passed down, not as legend, not as entertainment, but as instruction. The instruction was this: if you are traveling through a stretch of country that has a history, if the road has a weight to it, if the land on either side has absorbed things that the land holds onto, and if you are carrying anything that might attract attention, food, fruit, anything consumable, then you acknowledge the road. You speak to what is present. You offer, not the whole of what you carry, but a portion, a gesture. You say, this is for you, and I mean no disrespect, and I ask to pass safely. And you mean it. The meaning matters as much as the words. Aaron had not done this. He had not done this because he had forgotten. Or perhaps more accurately, because the modern, practical, deadline, managing part of his mind had never fully absorbed the instruction. He knew it the way you know things that were told to you in childhood before you were old enough to take them seriously. He knew it the way you know to say bless you when someone sneezes reflexively without understanding why. But the produce in his cargo area, the fruit, the vegetables, he had been carrying food through roads that apparently noticed such things, and he had not acknowledged the road, and now something was in the back of his truck asking him for some. Second, his hands. They were cold. Not ambient, temperature cold, not the chill of air conditioning. The cab was warm. His hands were cold in the specific, localized way that cold sometimes presents when it arrives from an interior source rather than from the surrounding environment. The cold was in his palms, in his fingers, In the webbing between them, a cold that felt applied, intentional, and his feet, the same cold in both feet simultaneously from the ankle down, as though someone had wrapped his hands and feet in something that held ice against the skin. Third, the voice had said, brother. Not a threat. Not a word of a person who believes they have some claim on you. Some pre-existing relationship that confers a degree of familiarity. Something that considered itself, in some sense, kin. Aaron made a decision. He made it quickly. Because the alternative, sitting on the verge of a county road in the Gotham dark with something in the back seat that had just addressed him as a brother, was not a sustainable situation. He spoke to the back seat. He spoke without turning around. He kept his eyes on the road ahead, and he said in the steadiest voice he could produce, which was not very steady but was all he had. He said, there is food in the back of the truck. You are welcome to it. I mean no disrespect to this road or to what is here. Take what you need. I asked to pass through safely. He said it the way his grandmother had described saying it years ago when he was young and half listening. He said it like he meant it. Because he did mean it. In that moment, on that verge, with the cold in his hands and his feet, and the presence in the back of the cab, he meant every word with a sincerity that he had not brought to anything in recent memory. He waited. The cold in his hands began to ease. Not immediately, gradually the weight of fever breaks, a degree at a time, withdrawing from his fingers, from his palms, from his feet, receding. The cab temperature normalized. The quality of presence in the back seat, that organized, patient stillness, began to shift. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a thinning, a lessening, the way a cloud moves off the sun. Aaron sat on the verge for another few minutes. Then he started the engine. He pulled back onto the road. He drove for the remainder of the journey. The final 40 minutes back to the depot. Nothing happened. The back seat was empty. The road was ordinary. The radio played. Aaron drove with his hands at 10 and 2 and did not once check the mirror. He returned the truck to the yard. He did his end of day paperwork. He spoke to his dispatcher about the delivery. He said nothing about any of the rest of it. That evening, he went home. He ate. He tried to watch television and found that he was not really watching it. He kept finding himself in the same thought, cycling through it, arriving at the same point, and then beginning again. The thought was this: the two people who had seen the figure in his truck had seen it before he had said anything, before he had made any acknowledgement or any offer, which meant that whatever had been in his truck had been there, visible apparently to outside observers, before it made itself known to him. It had been there for the entire journey, or close to it, sitting in the back seat, facing forward, waiting. But waiting for what? For him to notice, for the right moment, for him to stop somewhere so that it could speak without the engine noise covering its voice. Or just waiting, the way certain things wait, without agenda, without urgency, simply present in the way that things are sometimes present whether you invite them or not. The following morning, he went back to work. He drove the same routes. He passed through the same roads. He did not consciously alter his behavior or his routine. But when he drove through certain stretches with the particular quality of weight that he now found himself able to identify, the way you develop sensitivity to something once it has been brought to your attention, he spoke, not loudly, just quietly to whatever might be listening. He said something. He acknowledged the road, and he never again carried a cargo of food through any of at the start of the journey, saying clearly and simply, I see you. I mean, no disrespect. I am passing through. A week after the delivery run, Aaron told the story to his employer. Not because he wanted to. Because the truck had come back from its service check with a mechanical assessment that he couldn't account for. The service technician had found wear patterns on several components. Patterns consistent, he said, with the truck having been operated under conditions of significant additional load. The kind of load that would be produced by carrying several additional tons of cargo. The truck had gone out with a full load of produce and come back empty. But something had put the kind of stress on certain systems that you'd expect from something far heavier than an empty truck. His employer listened to this. Then he listened to Aaron's account of the journey. The dock supervisor, the diner, the cough, the voice, the cold. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, I know that road. I know what is on that road. I should have warned you before you took that route. Aaron asked him to explain. His employer said that certain stretches of road in that part of the country, particularly road that passed through or adjacent to old-growth forest, or road that ran beside old burial grounds, or road that had been used for a very long time by a very large number of people in transit, accumulated a kind of presence, not malevolent necessarily, not predatory, but aware, and territorial in a particular way, not territorial about the physical space, but territorial about what moved through that space, about what was carried through it, about whether the people carrying things through acknowledged the fact that they were guests. He said, the old drivers all knew this. The ones who had been on these roads for 30, 40 years. They had rituals, specific things they said or did when they came to certain stretches. They never had problems. The ones who didn't know, or who knew and forgot, sometimes had experiences like what you had. He said the figure that the dock supervisor and the diner owner had seen was not, in his understanding, hostile. It had not been trying to harm Aaron. It had been, and he used the word carefully, attending, accompanying, riding along in the way that these things sometimes ride along when something they are interested in passes through their territory. The voice, the request. Brother, give me some. His employer said that this was not uncommon in accounts he'd heard over the years. Not the exact words, the words varied, but the structure was consistent. A request, framed as between equals, framed with the familiarity of something that considers the road, and everything on it, as its extended household, and the acknowledgement that Aaron had made. The words he'd said to the empty cab on the verge of the road had worked. Not as a magical formula, not as a ritual with inherent power, but as a communication, as a signal that Aaron understood where he was and who he was among, that he was not ignoring them, that he saw them even if he couldn't see them. Aaron went home that evening and thought about this for a long time. 2 days later, he went back to the truck. It was parked in the yard between runs. He walked around it slowly, looking at it the way you look at something that you thought you understood and are now revising your understanding of. The cab, the cargo area, the space inside the locked, sealed, moving vehicle that had somehow, for the duration of a delivery run, been occupied by something that two separate living people had seen through the windows with their own eyes. He opened the rear door of the cargo area. He looked inside. The cargo area was empty, cleaned out from the last unloading. A few wooden pallets stacked against one wall. The smell of old produce, the ghost of previous loads. And in the far corner of the cargo area, something he had not noticed before. A watermelon, a large one, split open, as though it had been pressed from the outside until the rind gave way. The flesh inside was exposed, scooped, not by an implement. There were no clean edges, no tool marks. Scooped in the way that you eat a watermelon when you eat it with your hands. In curved, pressure, formed scoops, the kind that fingers make, the kind that a hand makes when it cups and presses and takes, and around the split rind, no seeds. Not scattered in the way that a watermelon split by impact would scatter its seeds, just removed. Taken. Aaron stood in the cargo doorway and looked at the watermelon for a long time. He had returned from the delivery run with an empty truck. He had checked the cargo area himself when he returned to the yard. It had been empty. He was certain of this. But the watermelon was there now, split and eaten. A large section of its interior consumed in a way consistent with being eaten by hand. Aaron did not know where the watermelon had come from. He did not know it had appeared in the cargo area. He did not know whether it had been there during the journey. Whether the voice that said, "Brother, give me some," had been answered not just by his words on the verge, but by something more literal, something that had been taken from the cargo before he even pulled into the first delivery bay, or whether it had appeared afterward. A confirmation, a receipt. He called his employer. He described what he'd found. His employer was quiet for a moment. Then he said, take the watermelon out, cut it into 4 equal pieces. Leave the pieces at the 4 corners of the yard, and tell everyone in the yard that they are not to touch those pieces until morning. Aaron did this. He cut the watermelon, what remained of it, into 4 sections. He placed one at each corner of the company yard. He told the dispatcher and the other drivers. None of them asked why. People who work long roads for long enough develop, he'd noticed, a tolerance for instructions they don't fully understand. The yard hands raised no objection. In the morning, Aaron was the first one in. He drove through the gate and got out and checked the 4 corners of the yard. The watermelon pieces were gone. All 4 of them. No rend, no seeds, no trace on the ground where they had rested. The concrete at each corner was clean and dry, as though nothing had ever been placed there. Aaron stood in the center of the yard and thought, whatever it is, it came here. It followed the truck back. It was here in this yard last night. And then he thought, and it took what it asked for, and it left. He has been driving these routes for 3 years since that day. He has not had another experience like that one. He has not seen figures in his mirrors that are not there. He has not heard voices from empty back seats. He has not felt the cold in his hands and feet that signals additional weight in a vehicle that should be carrying none. The roads, as far as he can tell, have been ordinary roads, but he speaks to them now. Every time he turns onto a stretch with that particular quality. The weight, the age, the sense of accumulated watching, he says something. Not a script, not a formula, just an acknowledgement. He says that he's passing through. He says he means no disrespect. And if he is carrying food, which in his line of work he almost always is, he says that he knows it and he offers it in the way that his employer described. Not literally, not by stopping and leaving produce at the roadside, but in intention. In the internal gesture of saying, I see you, and I know that I am among you, and I offer this passage with respect. Does it work? Is that the right framing for what he's doing? Is there a thing that hears him, that receives the offer, that makes a decision based on the quality of his sincerity? He doesn't know. I don't know. Nobody in this story knows. But I'll tell you what Aaron said when the person who collected this account asked him to summarize what he'd taken from the experience. He said this. He said, "My whole life, I drove through places I didn't know anything about. I thought a road was a road. I thought what was in the cab was what I put there. I thought the space inside a locked, moving vehicle was mine. Private, controlled. What I learned is that some roads are not empty. Some roads have been walked by too many people for too long, and some of those people didn't finish the journey, and they stayed, and they notice what passes through. And if you're carrying something, food, intention, haste, disrespect, they notice that too. I'm not saying they're evil. I'm not saying they want to hurt anyone. I'm saying they're there, and they have been there for a very long time, and the least you can do, the absolute least, is see them." 4 stories. 4 separate accounts sent in by listeners from 4 separate places involving 4 separate sets of people who had no connection to each other. And yet running through all 4 of them is the same thread, not a supernatural thread, not the obvious overlap of curses or entities or identical folklore, a subtler thread than that. In each story, the trouble began when something was ignored, when the evidence of a presence was dismissed, or when a warning was not taken seriously, or when the accumulated understanding of people who knew a place was set aside in favor of what seemed, at the time, like the more practical choice. Anil went back to the graves because the bell had been quiet for long enough. The 3 friends on the bamboo road challenged something openly and then went back twice. The truck drivers pushed through the forest road after the light had gone. Aaron carried cargo through country that noticed such things without saying a word to it. And in each case, the thing that was ignored, the presence that was dismissed or challenged or disrespected, responded, not always immediately, not always loudly, but consistently, with a patience that is, in its own way, the most frightening quality of all of these accounts. Because patience implies time. Patience implies that whatever is doing the waiting has been doing it for a while, and is comfortable doing it for a while longer. Patience implies that it is not worried about being believed, not worried about being taken seriously, not worried about whether anyone acknowledges it or not, because it knows something that all 4 of these stories, taken together, seem to be trying to tell us. It knows that eventually, inevitably, on a long enough timeline, somebody will notice. Somebody will hear the cough from the empty back seat. Somebody will look in the mirror and see the road behind them is empty when the truck should still be there. Somebody will wake up with the word yes already in their mouth, and not remember agreeing to anything. And when that happens, it won't need to introduce itself. You'll already know exactly what it is. Sleep well.